Happy New Year, everyone. This is Graham coming at you from 6 in the morning. I've spent way too much time editing. I just wanted to let you guys know two things. One, we had a little bit of an audio issue that I have tried to fix. Jack is a little quieter than everyone else. I'm sorry about that. In addition, this is a part 1. This episode was so long we had to divide it in 2. We recorded on 2 separate days. That second episode should be out within 10 days. I will do my best to make sure that happens. Otherwise, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you in the next episode. Grab a book and hit the beach. And Happy New Year. Hello and welcome to A Grain of Sanderson, a podcast where we are foolishly attempting to read all of Brandon Sanderson's work in publication order. I am joined by Taylor Lane.
Hello.
And Jack McLaughlin.
Hello.
And we are finally at The Way of Kings. We finally hit our show art.
We finally hit what is the book that is probably the reason Graham and I pitched the podcast idea to Taylor. And we decided to do this.
Yeah, I mean,
it was either Stormlight or it was the argument we had about Tress that inspired.
Probably both.
Yeah.
For the record, I guess spoilers for 2028. Tress of the Emerald Sea is one of the books I do not like.
No.
Which is probably the hottest take Graham has given so far on this podcast, because that is wildly beloved by the community.
There are some real ones out on Goodreads who are giving it 3-star reviews. I see you out there giving it 2-star reviews as well. I actually have the most liked 1-star review on Goodreads at the moment, which I'm sure when I reread that book, I probably won't hate it as much, but boy, was I... Oh.
You were not feeling it.
I was not feeling it. But yes, just as a little Easter egg for folks who haven't noticed, I'm going to put it in the show notes. Our lovely friend Ven took the cover art for The Way of Kings and pixel arted it, and then changed the cloud color to purple, and that became our logo.
Our logo.
But yes, once again, shout out Ven.
It's 3 a.m. We're in a bunker underneath the Nevada desert. It's,
We're not stealing their bit. Also, for the record, it is 10:30 in the morning.
Perfectly reasonable time.
I'm done with law school finals, so I'm free.
Congrats on being 1/6 a lawyer.
I am 1/6 of a lawyer, which means I can give you 1/6 of a legal advice.
No.
I can tell you the basics of contract formation now if you want.
Notice how we're doing bits to delay getting into this, because the summary is going to be long, and also, where do we even begin?
Well, what's our one-sentence summary?
Graham, this is the prelude, and then the summary will be the prologue.
It is safe to say that we are going to be talking about Mistborn, Elantris, and Warbreaker in this series, or in this podcast today.
Yeah.
And that we will not, hopefully, be talking about anything past The Way of Kings in the Stormlight Archives. So, because that's where we're at in reading.
I already, during the bonus episode recording, accidentally made a big spoiler just because I completely forgot it even was a spoiler.
Why did you reread the book then? The whole point of rereading the book is to know what the details you could say.
I can't believe you forgot it was a spoiler, because again, I haven't read Words of Radiance, but I know that the thing that Jack spoiled is a big reveal in that book.
Messed up.
Don't worry about
Messed
it. Anyway,
up.
Yeah.
I've been a fan of these books for so long. The facts of that universe are just so baked into my knowledge. It's like...
Yeah. Before we started, I almost spoiled something, like, just going, that's common knowledge, and then I realized, no, that's a thing that gets established in Words of Radiance, actually.
Do we want to begin? So, yeah, Way of Kings, probably what you would call the magnum opus of Brandon Sanderson. This is his attempt to do his own Wheel of Time, his own colossal epic fantasy series. It's planned to be 10 books. As of recording, book 5 came out 13 days ago, so we're halfway through the series being published now.
I mean, I think it's also worth mentioning that there's 5 books, but each book is over 1,000 pages each. So it's so much longer.
Way of Kings is like around 1,000 pages, and Wind and Truth is like 1,300 pages. But yeah, this is very much also for those of you interested in the Cosmere aspect. The beginning with Stormlight is where the Cosmere, the fact that like all of his books take place in the same universe, finally starts to matter. It's where a lot more crossovers start to happen. We don't get a lot of crossovers in this book, but this series
We get a
is the
couple.
one where it becomes. We get a couple, but they're not much bigger than the crossovers we got in the other books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, Hoyd is an actual character in this one.
Yes. Hoyd is an actual character with agency and goals and all that stuff.
I think to his detriment, or at least getting more page time, I think is to his detriment a little bit. We also get some fun cameos that don't really pay off, at least yet. I mean, it's possible to show up.
They're very much like Easter. They're very much just like there to tell you, yeah, the Cosmere is a thing. People can move between planets and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, we can just jump straight into our one-sentence summary.
I can go. I said that we find out very early on that the Way of Kings is empathy, and that never really changes through the entire. Because I was also should say I was like making jokes like, well, what is the Way of Kings to like people I know who have finished the book, and no one ever gave me an answer, and actually the answer is empathy is the Way of Kings.
My one-sentence summary is, and I blatantly stole this from an episode of Running the Game that I rewatched recently. It's 300 pages of incredible fantasy action packed into 1,000 pages.
Incredible. I love Coville so much. Author of Taylor's favorite book, Priest.
Could not finish that book.
Was describing 3rd edition of D&D, which was described as 30 minutes of fun packed into 3 hours.
Yes. My one-sentence summary is this is the most Mormon book yet. We'll get into that with all of its wonderful little implications. I do also want to say that when I first read this book, I had a mild hatred of it, which means that I hated reading it, and then largely it didn't take up a lot of space in my brain. And now I am mostly indifferent to this book. So Jack is at least on some level successful. I have gone from hating a Sanderson book to being indifferent.
However, Graham gets their own vindication in that I always said that, yeah, it's slow, but like plenty of stuff happens. It turns out everything I remembered happening in Way of Kings, all of the cool, exciting stuff happens in the last 30% of the book, which is 300 pages.
Yeah.
It is a slow book. It's very much the first 70% is very, very meticulous setup.
And, also, not all of that is, really meticulous setup. Some of it's cooking with gas. I mean, all of Part 2, I would say, is good.
When we get into it, you're going to have to remind me.
Part 2 is when we go back and forth between Kaladin and Dalinar's perspective.
For the first time.
Oh, that's a long break without Sean. On that note, I can jump straight into the summary.
Yes.
A Way of Kings opens first with a prelude showing us one of the heralds, an ancient figure of mythology, Kalik, walking through a battlefield contemplating the destruction and violence that it caused, as well as fearing what comes next. He thinks about how he has to return to the place of nightmares, where he will suffer some unspecified torment now that the battle is over. He reaches the meeting place designated by the other heralds, finding only Jezrien, the king of the heralds, standing there among 8 honor blades buried into the ground. While there, Jezrien tells him that the other heralds have also broken under the torment and have decided not to return to...
I believe they describe it as damnation. At least once.
Not to return to damnation, leaving the one of them that did die and was forced to return to, on his own, maintain the Oath Pact. Something that we do not learn more about other than it is apparently a very, very important thing. Kalik and Jezrien agree to tell humanity that they had won, they had defeated the final desolation, which to them is an easy enough lie that may even be true. The next chapter cuts to 4,000 years in the future. Sorry, not next chapter, the prologue, and follows Seth's son Villano as he assassinates the king of Aleth. The king is hosting a grand feast to celebrate a treaty between Alethkar and the mysterious Parshendi, a strange talking and thinking cousins to the Parshmen, the slave race that...
Sando loves a slave race.
But for some reason, the Parshendi have sent Seth to kill the king only hours after the signing. Seth does so in a brilliant display of surge binding, magic that hasn't been seen in thousands of years. He sucks in stormlight out of the lanterns and uses it to power abilities that let him run on walls, change objects' gravity, and lash things together. After King Gavilar is killed, it plunges Alethkar into a war of vengeance in which they chase the Parshendi to their home in the Shattered Plains to begin a 6-year-long siege against the traitors. We then jump 6.5 years into the future again to finally meet one of our main characters, with story not from Kaladin's perspective, but from someone watching Kaladin's perspective. Kaladin is a dark-eyed surgeon's apprentice, turned soldier, turned eventually slave. He is forced into High Prince Sadius's army as on bridge crew, where he is made to carry bridges that allow the army to cross the chasms of the Shattered Plain, often being made to charge unarmed and unarmored against heavy arrow fire. Few bridgemen survive more than a few weeks of this. He is pushed to his darkest point before deciding he's going to rescue himself and protect the other bridgemen, and begins to train them in secret to escape. During this time, he makes a connection with the mysterious windspread named Silfrena, and starts to develop strange powers similar to those used by the assassins 6 years ago. Along the way, we learn that he only joined the army initially to protect his younger brother after he was drafted. He failed to protect his younger brother, Tien, and later, after heroically defeating a shard bearer, claiming their mythical shards, he was betrayed by his commander and forced into slavery. Shalin, meanwhile, has been chasing the heretic and sister of the new king, Yasna Kholin, across the world in an attempt to become her ward, doing so as a cover for her real plan to steal Yasna's Soulcaster, a device capable of transmuting nearly any material into any other material to save her family from destitution. During this time, she falls in love with the research she is made to do, learns more about Yasna and the world, and starts to fall in love with the priest, and grapples with the morality and feasibility of her goal to steal Yasna's Soulcaster. Back on the Shattered Plains is Dalinar, brother of the murdered king and uncle to the new one, a former warlord of infamous skill and brutality, who, in the last 6 years, has instead become a bastion of honor, upholding the codes of war and disapproving of the excess and frivolity of the other high princes. He has also been seeing visions of the past he believes are from the Almighty, guiding him to unite the fractured high princes who are a nation in name only. He struggles against the corruption and immorality of the other leaders around him while also losing his taste for battle and potentially going insane from the visions. At the end of the story, Dalinar has joined forces with another high prince and former friend Sadius in an attempt to bring a swift end to the war, trusting him because the visions tell him to, but during a large battle is betrayed and left to die against overwhelming odds. Kaladin, who is a bridgeman in Sadius's army, notices an opportunity during the betrayal to escape with his fellow bridgemen. Instead, he and his men look to the dying Kholin army and turn to go rescue them and provide a bridge by which they may escape. Kaladin, injured and tired, learns that Silfrena is not a wind spren but an honor spren, and he swears the second oath of the Knight's Radiance, bursting alight with power, and is able to lead the betrayed army to safety. Back at camp, Dalinar confronts Sadius, and instead of starting a war that might shatter Alethkar, buys Kaladin along with every other bridgeman's freedom from Sadius in exchange for his priceless Shardblade Oathbringer. Meanwhile, back in Shalin's story, she has successfully stolen Yasna's Soulcaster after witnessing her kill 4 muggers with it, but can't discover how it works. She starts seeing strange creatures in the background of her drawings that lead her to think she is going crazy. She manages to somehow soulcast a crystal goblet into blood without holding the Soulcaster and feigns a suicide attempt to cover it up. While in the hospital, Brother Kobsold, the priest she was falling in love with, tries to poison Yasna, but something goes wrong and he poisons himself and Shalin instead. Shalin returns the stolen Soulcaster, revealing her theft, and Yasna is able to soulcast the poison from her blood. Betrayed, Yasna banishes Shallan from her presence, but Shallan returns and confronts her, having realized that Yasna's Soulcaster was a fake, and both Yasna and herself have somehow developed the ability to soulcast on their own. Yasna takes Shallan into her confidence and reveals her true aim of her research, the ancient enemy of humanity, the Voidbringers. She also reveals that she believes the Parshmen, the slave race, are actually the enslaved descendants of these mythical enemies. The very epilogue of the story, Wit, or Hoid, is in the capital city of Kholinar to witness a man appear in the city claiming to be Talanet.
Tone is...
Tone.
Yeah, he describes himself as Tone in this epilogue.
As Tone, the herald that back in the prelude had died and was left abandoned to maintain the Oath Pact on his own, returns to the world and declares that that he has failed and a desolation has arrived.
Yes.
The desolation.
The true desolation.
The true desolation. Yeah, the desolations, basically in the ancient history of this world, humanity was repeatedly beset by this...
Actually, no, Jack, you don't get to describe this. Taylor and I are going to describe this because we don't know as much as you. Um,
Fair enough.
because you are going to say things that we don't actually know yet.
I am being kept on a short leash.
I think all that we sort of know from Dalinar's visions is that loosely there were multiple desolations where people fought the Voidbringers, and the Voidbringers in some of the visions look like big ass monsters. They describe them as great shells, or is like a class of creature that can be where it's just.
That wasn't in the vision. That was in Yasna's research. She found a drawing.
No. But there's also a vision that Dalinar has where there's a bunch of big ass monsters just like on the battlefield after a desolation.
Right, made of stone, look like kind of skeletal.
Yeah,
is how they're described. Yeah.
I think those are the Thunderclasts, though we don't really know what they are.
You get the name from the prelude with the herald. He describes something with the same way Dalinar describes it and calls it a Thunderclast.
Yeah. So there's Thunderclasts, but they're also like these shadow creatures that will attack.
I know that's not a spoiler because they said it in the vision, but one of the Knights Radiant in the vision calls those Midnight Essence.
Okay, so those are something different. Yeah. And then we find out that like 9 out of 10 people are dead. Die in these things. So they're very lethal. But they're just like kind of waves of destruction, I would say, are the desolations. I didn't really pay attention that much to those. It seemed like the one true desolation was what was the most important there, which was eternal darkness, killing gods and stuff.
And also, as we've learned with Sanderson, if something is relevant again, he will re-explain it.
True.
Yeah, the desolation is just a cycle of apocalypses that 4,000 years ago humanity believed they beat the final one.
Yeah.
I think according to their mythology, it's like ancient mythology. The Voidbringers like took over heaven, kicked humanity out, and then like followed humanity to destroy them. And then the desolation, beating the final desolation, was forcing the Voidbringers back to heaven, like to just be in heaven. And then their mythology is all built around when they die, they'll go join the ranks of the Almighty's army to fight the Voidbringers and force them out of heaven, which I think they call the Tranquiline Halls, is what they call heaven.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and then at the end of this book, and then the visions Dalinar is receiving is warning of a final true desolation coming.
Right. Okay. If you watch our bonus episode, we talk about how this is just something quick that I wanted to start because I was excited when I saw it. If you watch our bonus episode, we talk about how the question of if Shallan has a shard blade or not. And I'm happy to report I came back after going through my entire book and, gathering all my notes and stuff, that actually in the first part, there is a mention of her. She has like a slight flashback where she says she's holding a long silvery sword sharp enough to cut through stones as if they were water. So that paired with the thing later where the 10 heartbeats thing does confirm that she does confirm for sure, at least in my eyes. I mean, a long silvery sword that can cut through the stones as if it were water is kind of hard to
Yeah. And again, there were tons of fans who were like, does she have one? Is this just a theory?
It was funny rereading because I like Graham. I distinctly remember it being like a theory that Shallan has a shard blade. But on reread, it's like that's not a theory. He's telling you without telling you the actual words. Shallan has a shard blade.
Yeah. Like just put 2 and 2 together. So yes,
it's the most straightforward like theory.
Shallan does have a shard blade. He does not need to go. He will go on to confirm it, but he doesn't have to.
Because they're important, shard blades, along with Southern Utah, are the 2 things that inspired this entire series originally. It's what made Brandon go, I want to write these books.
Mm-hmm.
Shard blades are giant, surfboard-sized magic swords, are like supernaturally like light, so despite being so big you can actually like wield one, and can cut through anything. Instead of cutting through living flesh, they pass through it, and I think the words they use is sever the soul, which cause your eyes to burn out and you to just die, as well as any flesh that it cuts through without killing you dying. Like if you get your arm cut through with a shard blade, the arm's dead, never to be healed again. And then also you can like summon them and dismiss them. Like you can let go, it puffs into mist, and then start summoning it, and 10 heartbeats later it appears in your hand.
Yeah.
And they're kind of a big part of the story because legendary, super powerful swords, priceless, worth more than kingdom. There's only like a few dozen of them, or I think at some point we hear that there's only like about 100 known shard blades in the world.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the story orients around them, a lot of culture orients around them. They're like really important. Priceless artifacts. And then the other thing is Southern Utah.
Yep.
Olive Roshar, which this was my favorite part of the book. There's no soil, there's no normal plants. It's a really alien world, the world this story takes place on. It's fields of stone. All of the plants are kind of weird and vine-like, and I often hear it described as it's like the bottom of the ocean, instead like brought up to be land. All of the animals are, for the most part, crustacean. Kremlings, bugs, or like giant crab-like creatures. The only exception are a few earth animals like chickens, horses. I think they mentioned pigs at one point, but like a very small number of like earth animals. There's also the high storms, which is every couple of weeks,
Couple of days.
across the entire
Couple of days, yeah.
There's at least one a week.
Because
There might be
anytime
a
someone
yeah.
gets paid with dun spears, they're like, why didn't you charge them? Like, as
Yeah.
if this is
Yeah.
something that you could do extremely routinely.
Very routinely, a high storm, which is like a category 6 hurricane, like a massive destructive storm, sweeps across the whole continent, always from the exact same direction. It's destructive enough to throw boulders and break mountains and do all that stuff. And all of society is oriented around this. Like villages are built on the leeward side of hills. Cities are built so that they can be protected from high storms. It's very much a regular weather phenomenon that all of society is built around.
Yeah, and so are all the plants, and which
Yeah.
is why the animals are all like crustaceans, because they need shells to protect themselves, because the storm wall is really destructive and really powerful when it first hits, and then it kind of trickles off at the end.
And the last thing I want to explain, just because we're going to talk about them a lot and we just have to explain a little bit, is spren. Also on this world are spren, which is the catch-all term for like spirits. Essentially, there's these little incorporeal ghost-like spirits that show up in response to certain natural phenomenon or emotions. Like if someone feels a lot of fear spren will start to appear around them. These little spirits that I can't remember how fear spren. I think they're described as like clawing hands. Or maybe that's agony spren. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that's sort of fun about Spren in general is just like, once again, we're so in anime because Sanderson has given a textual reason for us to have anime particle effects fucking everywhere.
Oh, yeah. Basically, everywhere you look in Roshar, there's these little sparkly, glowing spirits associated. There's wind spren, like these little that like look like ribbons of light or little people just flying along with the wind. Rain spren, which I think are like look like melting candles that appear in puddles. Which, fun fact about the writing process, apparently when Brandon Sanderson writes the story like the first time, he does not include all of these spren, like all the like little like, because it'll be things like Shalon felt bad and she attracted some shame spren or something like that,
Yeah.
right? He does not include spren on his first draft. He goes back and adds it, and I think he describes it literally as particle effects. He describes it as like post-processing, like he just like coloring in the lines. Like he goes back on the second write through and like adds in at appropriate places where spren would show up or be noted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the spren are really cute, and they're really cool.
Yeah, there's also something going on with the Spren where I'm sure they have multiple inspirations, but the two that I see brought up most frequently is there's the Mormon belief that like there are pieces of God. I will find the article that I want to quote from in a second that describes that more succinctly. But the other one is obviously Sanderson has a huge love for, I mean, he speaks Korean, but he has a big love for things that are Japanese. There's a huge love for Japanese video games. He like every time he talks about video games, he puts like a bunch of JRPGs and action games like Dark Souls from Japan on his list, that sort of thing. I don't know if he's an anime fan, but just based on his books, I feel like he must be. But the thing that sort of comes up is a lot of people compare the spren to Japanese Shinto beliefs of kami, where like there are spirits of things.
I was going to say like animism, where like everything. I
Yeah.
think they even say in this book, like a character says that like references like everything has a spren, even if you don't see it.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that chair has a spren, you just might not see it.
Yeah.
That's one of my favorite things about the Stormlight Archive is this is the first book he's written where the fantasy world it takes place in actually feels like alien and different and like a different new world, because Mistborn gets close, but Mistborn is kind of just like post-apocalypse Earth.
Yeah.
It's Earth, but there's like a lot of ash. It's like a nuclear winter. Warbreaker, nothing about the world itself is very fantasy. It's like it's a normal Earth-like jungle, Earth-like environment, all of that stuff.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think, did anything else we read have like a really alien environment to it? Not really.
No, this is kind of I mean, and this book is widely held up as like some of the greatest world building in contemporary fantasy. Like when people talk about world building, they often talk about the Stormlight Archive.
To go on to a little bit of a fan rant too, it's like the thing that always attracted me about Stormlight and like made me such a fan of it was that not only is the world itself really unique and weird, but you can tell he put a lot of effort into when he was coming up with like the cultures and the people and the tradition. It really felt like he was making a people that existed in this world. Traditions, language, things that's what at least it felt like to me. It's like this does feel like a culture that exists in a world with high storms and with everything being crustaceans and with stone. Like it to me it always felt like he didn't just make a crazy world, he made a crazy world and a people that would live in.
I would, with the caveat that I would say some elements of this are extremely well considered, and then some elements of it feel very arbitrary at the same time, which is fine. Like, I mean, on some level, like...
No, I would honestly go as far as to say I completely disagree with that. I think I was really disappointed in the way that he neglected his societies. I think that there was so much more. There was so much world building that went into the environment, that went into like these buildings, that went into the things that they did. And then he was just like, patriarchy, I guess. Like, I don't know. I don't really care about that stuff. And it's like, the thing is, like, it's cool that he did like the whole... Like women are the only ones who can read, but that literally does, like, it doesn't have any weight. It doesn't mean anything. Like, I wish it meant something. Like, he neglected the society, like, at least Alethi society. It was so disappointing for me. I was like, this is the herald of, I wish that the thing that people hold up for world building, he could have just put, like, a little more thought into, like, the society.
I was excited for you to see the whole, like, women, because the reason I was excited, because for listeners, in traditional society, it's considered a feminine thing to read and do art and research and all that stuff, while like it's masculine to like be a soldier, be a warrior, and also be a leader, be the person. So in general, men are illiterate, they don't know how to read, and women are the only ones that have like writing and reading and all that stuff.
Well, there's an additional caveat that they have a glyph system that men can read. So, like, men are able to read certain things, but, like, complex writing is reserved for women.
I was excited because they touch on it very little this book. I think I thought more of it happened this book, but it actually happens in later books. Address the fact that like women are the ones who like control books and knowledge and all that stuff.
They do.
I thought it would be interesting to you because especially when we were talking about Elantris, where it's like the women had because that book was so sexist, women had absolutely no power because they weren't even be referenced in their ability to like be the mother of kings and such. And then we also talked about it a lot in the Wheel of Time episode where it's like supposedly that was a matriarchy, but then when you like really look at it, it's like no, the women still, their power depends on men. They don't actually have unique power. I thought it would be interesting in this book how yes, it is a patriarchy. The book is not shy about that. It is, but like women have this kind of in the background, like the book acknowledges that no, this is still a patriarchy, but women have like carved out this like area of power and agency for themselves.
Yeah, it's not really in this book. I mean, there's a little of that where, I mean, Yasna is absolutely leveling every bit of power that she can by being a scholar. And we
Yeah.
see several other prominent female scholars. Navani is one of them. Shaolin is in the process of becoming one. But yeah, I mean, a lot of this feels...
It's completely neglected in my eyes. Like, I think that that's like a really interesting thing, but at the end of the day, Sanderson wasn't really interested in fleshing out his women or making them... Okay, I think something that really stood out to me that really made my stomach turn was especially how the idea of reading is like men not reading is the privilege. Men scoff at reading. Men are like Kaladin in his backstory is like, ugh, I would never learn how to read. And it's like...
Yeah.
Imagine if like a woman, like if you just like flip the script and like women who historically have never been allowed to read, like the fact of the matter is that reading is freedom. In this book, not reading is the privilege. Like men have the privilege of not reading, which is so like not true to like how power works. Like it's so like...
Because I mean, what this leads to is even when the Alethi armies are at war, there's a lot of women there because the women are needed there to do the reading and the scribing and all that stuff.
Why would women bother reading to men at all? Like, what is, like the only reason why women even bother to read to these guys is because of religion, is because, like, of society's norms and stuff. I don't have time for you. You can't read. Go, leave me alone. I'm doing stuff. Like, I've got scribe work to do. I'm a busy woman. Like, learn to read yourself. That is the sentiment that should have been happening here. Like, doesn't make, like, I just, like, it's like a nice idyllic way of thinking about how things should, like, might be. But, like, the fact that they can't read has, like, never got in their way. Like, they still had the privilege of always getting whatever they wanted. And like, there's also the other side of it where, like, not reading should impact the way that you think through things logically. Like, if you can't structure your thoughts in such a way... I was confused when Kaladin was so logical and when Dalinar was so logical. I was like, and the way that things cascaded from one thought to another, I was like, you had to learn that somewhere. Like, I guess, like, if you didn't.
It's important to know that those two characters are educated, but again, they cannot.
Yeah, so they do consume books, but it's by a woman reading it.
Well, I don't even know if Kaladin gets that. I mean, it's possible.
Kaladin doesn't, but Dalinar does.
Dalinar does.
Yeah. Like, Kaladin had medical text read to him by his mother as part of his surgeon training.
Yeah.
There's, like, other things that were just completely neglected that I was sad about. Like, the fact that in Kaladin's backstory is kind of the only time we really learn about what women who do not have power are doing kind of in the farmlands. And so I was really paying attention to... Dark-eyed women are completely... They're not present in this book, which... You know,
I mean, dark eyes in general, we'll get into.
Well, can I finish my point?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. So, like, I was paying attention to dark-eyed women in this book. Kaladin is overhearing a conversation at some point where these two women are talking to each other and they're supposed to be kind of bratty, and they're like, oh, they didn't have a woman there with him to... Because he's talking about how they think that his dad had stolen from the High Prince or something. And so the women specifically say that they should have had a woman there with them to make sure that what was said was written down. They didn't say that they needed a scribe. They said they wanted a woman there. And then it's revealed later that actually Kaladin's mom is the only person in his town who knew how to read. And so I was like, it was just neglected. Like, he didn't care that like, about those minute things that are important. Oh, and then there was another part of the world building where Shallan, it's like such a small thing. It's like all the small details that he paid so close attention to, and everything else, it just seemed like didn't care about, like, keeping this, like, only women read and write kind of thing. And, like, the power imbalance that would come from that. Because, like, Shallan goes to, in the very beginning of the book, Yasna rejects her at first. And so Shallan's like, I'm going to learn myself. And she walks her way down to the bookstore, and 3 out of 5 of the books that she was told to purchase were written by men. If this was flipped, and if, like in the real world, men historically were the only people to have written things, there should be a power imbalance there where women should just blatantly disregard anything a man has ever written. There should be maybe like one book that's like the star, you know, I'm thinking of like
Yeah.
Emily Dixon, like she was important because like she was like one of the first women to ever write anything. And it's like, why are there any men in Shallan's like repertoire at all?
Yeah, because again, I mean, there is a mild implication here that the world wasn't always this way, but also at the same time, we know that there's been at least 4,000 years where men don't read.
And like, even if it was less than that, like there should have been some sort of, it makes more sense for there to be some sort of campaign against men's and their ideas. Like there should have been a erasure.
Where is like the female Aristotle that Shallan would be reading? Like, that's the sort of thing that this book is lacking. There's a Shinovar scholar who we never actually get to hear her words, and I was disappointed by that, because I was like, oh...
It's just noted that it's odd to have a Shinovar. Like, that's like casual racism on Shallan's part.
Yes. Shallan is such a racist. It's crazy.
Oh god, it's so funny. It's to the point of near comedy, how prejudiced she is against so many people. But you're absolutely right, Taylor, that it doesn't feel like a world where only women read, except on just like occasional interpersonal interactions. I think like the explanation given for why they don't think anything about books written by men is because either A, and this is talked about, either A, it wasn't actually written by a man, it was dictated by a man to a woman who wrote it down, or B, the priest class, the ardents, they're exempt from the gender norm expectations. So if you're an ardent and a man, you're expected to know how to read. A lot of male authors would be priests. But I think you're absolutely right. It does feel like this is a had a cool thought for world building and then never took it further than just the surface level.
I know, which is so disappointing because of all the it would be more it was more forgivable in other books where the world building wasn't so deep. Like, he thought so long and hard about everything, and it just feels like, really?
This is making me think, and this is going to be a really interesting part about talking about this book, is because, and this like can lead into some interesting talk about like his craft, because I have to resist the temptation, because I know it wouldn't actually be interesting for discussion, of being like, you'll say something like that, like, oh, they don't address this culture, and my immediate reaction is to think like, oh, but in book 2 they dig into this, or in book 3 they go into this. But that's not actually like an interesting way to engage with the book, because you haven't read those. So I'm just telling you like, oh, they'll deal with this later. But that happens so much. Brandon Sanderson really feels like he's writing knowing he's going to have more books to explain things. And so this is very common, especially in Stormlight, where there'll be elements of the story that aren't addressed, aren't dug into, and it feels like a missing beat, but there's also an element of like, he just hasn't gotten to it yet. And that's not an excuse. That's not like a good thing. He probably should have gotten to it by this point. But like, it's just an interesting kind of engagement with this book, because in isolation, it's like, yeah, like he doesn't dig into that. But I know that in later books, he does dig into it.
And the other thing is how much of this is a reasonable criticism of this book that Sanderson is then responding to in later books. It's not, because again, a lot of his community has the impression of Sanderson as, I mean, we made this joke or this point in our Mistborn episode of like, Sanderson is divine. The fact that his fan base literally describes things he's described that are canon, but not in a book yet, as words of Brandon, the words of God. I think oftentimes Sanderson is responding to criticism and working that into his books. They're not...
I think the fact that this is a first book and that it was neglected is meaningful, because it shows that he likely included things later on because someone pointed out.
And also, like, I'm fine with a slow pace. I'm fine with, like, really meticulous world building. There's a lot of stuff in here that I think is cool, but then there's a lot of stuff in here that I think is arbitrary, and then there's stuff where I'm like, well, why is this here? This is so much wasted time for something that could be more interesting. Like, for example, the saddle arc is so dumb. Okay, for the listeners, the king... Elhokar? That's his name?
Elhokar. The son of the assassinated.
The son of the assassinated king is paranoid. And because he's so paranoid, he stages an assassination attempt on himself where he cuts his saddle strap. and then goes into a fight. In one of the coolest scenes in the book, Dalinar has to rescue him by basically fighting one of these giant crab scorpions and grabbing its pincer and preventing it from killing the king. It's a really cool scene. But then there's like, I would say like a solid 10 to 12 chapters dedicated to the investigation of this. Now, it's not in the detail, it's just a background plot that's going on, but it's just not very compelling.
Yeah, like the reason Elokar did this is because he doesn't think people are taking the threat of assassination seriously, so he has to stage an assassination attempt so people will be like, oh god, he's right, people are trying to kill him.
Well, can I jump in here for a second?
Oh, go for
Please.
it.
Because I was really proud of this. My boyfriend is currently on book 3, and I was talking to him about Elhokar, and I was like, well, I kind of forgive him a bit. He's going through the same thing Shallan's going through. And then he was like, what? Because he missed a little tiny detail that I caught.
I was wondering if you were going to catch
where
that.
he says that he has been seeing, he's like, no, like the assassins are around me. Actually, I have it bookmarked. I should just read it. And so he says, Elhokar is talking to Sadius and Dalinar at the end, and he says, we go to war for years and years, never noticing the real villains, working quietly in my own camp. They watch me, always, waiting. I see their faces in mirrors, symbols twisted, inhuman. And so I certainly forgave Elhokar there when he
I
had
still
no
hate
clue
him.
what was going on.
I am so happy you caught that.
He
Yeah.
didn't have
I'm
his
so
big
happy you
sis
caught that.
around to help him out because the two of them are now in cahoots.
He's seeing the same creatures in the corner of his vision that Shallan sees in her drawing when she thinks she's going crazy.
That's
Yes.
so cool.
With the implication that he could probably do the same magic as Shallan if Yasna was around there to teach him.
So, like, if he's freaking out about that, like, I would also probably be freaking out about that. Like, that makes a lot more sense to me than him just, like, being, like, a young, crazy
Well, he's a
king
king whose father was assassinated in a brutal way. So, like the best explanation, the non-supernatural explanation, is that he's a king. He's a relatively weak king, like weak-willed, and his father was assassinated, and so he's like, oh, of course they're also going to come for me.
I also still hate him though.
Oh, he's an insufferable whiny babe. His own mother in the book calls him a weak man.
Yes. And also, again, we'll have to save this for when we get into the Parshendi, but what happens is the Parshendi use Seth to assassinate the king. The king is assassinated in a pretty cool scene.
We'll also have to talk about more detail.
And then the implication is, they say repeatedly, the Parshendi who were responsible for the assassination
they claimed
credit and were killed.
Yeah, when the Parshendi had, like, the Parshendi leaders stayed behind to be like, we're the ones who assassinated him, while the, like, Parshendi people, like, ran away.
Yes, exactly. So, as far as I'm concerned, that's justice. Like, if it's like, I mean, like, on some level, I mean, like, granted you might want further revenge, but also, like it's a real Hammurabic code, eye for an eye, Jesus. Hammurabic code, eye for an eye sort of thing. Like, I don't know why Alethi society doesn't see that as justice on some level, because their response is not, okay, they killed our king, the leaders of the Parshendi are now also dead. Their response is not to, like, think about this or enter a further negotiation or ask for an explanation. They start a genocidal crusade.
Well, that's it. But we kind of do get an explanation for why they do that, because the Alethi are obsessed with war. War is good for its own benefit, and Dalinar is the only person. It's a break from Alethi traditional ways of thinking when Dalinar goes, we never figured out why they killed the king. Maybe we should. Maybe we should be more concerned about that. And that's framed as this big break from traditional Alethi thinking.
Yes, but also at the same time, like, the default response is a genocidal crusade. And, like, Elhokar is all about it. And it's like, okay, I guess that's where we're going.
It's almost like the Alethi are, like, not a good culture.
Well, all the High Princes are, like, comic book villains. So, like, they're evil to the point of, like, almost, like, just to make Dalinar seem like a crazy, amazing hero.
And I'm okay with that. All of them own slaves. They can be extremely evil.
Before we dig into that, I just want to make one more point earlier about Graham. You were talking about the outlining and this whole like belief that he always knows what's going on. He does definitely do a lot of good outlining in terms of the broad strokes.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I believe that when he was writing book 1, he knew what the end of broadly what the end of book 5 was.
Right.
Yeah.
But then you're absolutely right that there's definitely a response to criticism or a response to holes in his story, and there's perfect evidence for this where it's like the first time we get like a really good representation of a disabled character, of a physically disabled character, is like book 3.5, because like he does occasional novellas that act as little like interlude books between the bigger books. It's like 3.5 and then like into book 4, and in the interviews about that book, he's like, yeah, like I, going into this book for the first time, like started hiring sensitivity readers. Like when he was putting out the call for beta readers, he was specifically seeking some beta readers that had the same physical disability as the character he was writing, because he was really concerned in doing it right. So it is very much like he has this like broad stroke outline for what he wants to do, and he has these like kind of begins with surface level, and then yeah, as he writes the books, he does turn back to be like, I did not give this thing the depth or the focus it deserved.
Yeah.
And once again, that's going to be like this whole episode, I'm going to be holding back, like as I should, but I'm going to be holding back on like you guys will say things like once we like, especially when we talk about the Parshendi, it's going to be a lot of like, oh, this feels kind of weird the way they're represented. Well, I meanwhile knowing it's like, well, but we're going to learn about, we're going to like, this is going to make sense in book 2, but that doesn't excuse the impression you get reading book 1, especially since if you're reading these as they came out, you would have read book 1 and then had to wait a few years for book 2 to come out.
Yeah.
To get those explanations where,
3 years.
Okay, it makes sense now.
Actually, wait, no, 4 years. Because I always think Way of Kings is 2011 for some reason, but no, it's 2010, and Words of Radiance is 2014. So, yeah, 4 years.
But all that to say is, Taylor, you're absolutely right that, like, that little bit of gender stuff is very much just, like, a very surface level that isn't given the same world-building depth that he's clearly capable of.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, let's talk a little bit about safe hands, just because I think this is a good description of something that's relatively arbitrary. And Sanderson said that the inspiration for this is in China, the practice of foot binding, where women typically would have their feet bound to make them small. Now, the reasons why for this are extremely varied. Some of it is just like women with prettier feet are like more beautiful, or with smaller feet are more beautiful. There's also explanations that are like, let me find the exact source for this so I don't sound like I'm just talking out of my ass.
I read, actually, I'm rereading Iron Widow. I'm about to reread Iron Widow, but the main character in that book has her feet bound, and the descriptions in Iron Widow by
Jiran Zhejiao, I believe. Granted, that pronunciation, dog shit. My Chinese is awful. But
did you read Iron Widow? Because
yeah, I did when it came out. I'm a big fan of her YouTube channel, so I picked up her book.
Yeah, so the second book is coming out actually the same day that this podcast comes out. On the 24th, I pre-ordered it. I'm very excited, so I'm rereading it. I'm about to reread it. But yeah, so the main character in that book has her feet bound, and it's described in that book, at least, as extremely painful. And I think similar to the safe hands is a way to control women's bodies, but specifically the feet is so potent because you know, if your feet are completely disfigured, you can't run away, you can barely walk, really.
Yes,
every step is extremely painful.
So this is from Wikipedia, and they're citing a book called Sexuality Now and Bodies Under Siege. Those are two different books. An effect of the bound feet was the lotus gait, the tiny steps and swaying walk of a woman who has been bound. Women with such deformed feet avoid placing weight on the front of the foot and intended to walk predominantly on their heels. Walking with bound feet necessitated bending the knees slightly and swaying to maintain proper movement and balance, a dainty walk that was also considered erotically attractive to some men. And then here's the one that really got me, where I'm like, I need to find the source for this because I don't want to talk out of my ass because it's so insane. Some men found the smell of the bound feet attractive. It also apparently believed that bound feet would cause the layers of folds to develop in the vagina, and the thighs would become sensuously heavier and the vagina tighter.
Oh my god.
And all of this is the inspiration for Safe Hands, which is basically just that on Roshar, at least according to the religion Alethi follows, which is like Mormonism, which not everyone in the world follows, but all the main characters we follow do. The left hand of a woman is considered like
sinful.
Considered like erotic. It's something that has to be like covered.
Well, actually,
it's a private part.
It's a private part.
What's interesting is Sanderson says in book 1 he did not intend for it to be erotic.
Lie.
Yeah, I mean...
Liar! There's literally a point where Kaladin looks at some whore's left hand and gets hard.
Basically.
What the hell?
Yeah.
Liar! He's crazy. He's crazy for gaslighting his fans.
Inspired by the bound feet. Like, it's like, there's... But yeah, it's like noble women, light eyes will have like their dresses are all designed with a sleeve that's long enough to like fully cover it. Dark-eyed women typically just wear a glove.
Yeah, and if a woman is young enough, they don't have to wear a glove or hide their safe hand at all. Kaladin's childhood crush, who is a light-eyed noble woman, the daughter of a city lord, not a high-ranking noble, but he is, when he's hanging out with her, when they're both young kids, she doesn't wear a glove or a sleeve around him, and like he has a thought to himself where he's like looking at his safe hand or her safe hand when he's like, oh, this probably won't last much longer.
I definitely believe him when he says he intended, like consciously intended it to not be erotic,
but it is.
No, but that's what I think. Like, I think it's him having an oversight or not recognizing a subconscious thing, because religious figures are exempt from this. Female ardents don't need to cover their safe hand, and no one's ever leering at like a female ardent's uncovered safe hand. And also, Syl, the Windspren, or I guess we learn later Honorspren, that he's like bound to, like made friends with, she's feminine. She's described as looking like a woman, uses she, her pronouns. She's described as like a woman, doesn't have a sleeve, doesn't cover her safe hand. And Kaladin even notes she didn't cover her safe hand, but why would she? Like, she's like a spirit. She's not like she's not like an actual like human woman who would be expected to follow those norms. On the one hand, it's like this erotic thing, but then to the people that don't need to wear it, no one sees that as erotic, even though they definitely would. It still would be seen as like, well, that's a woman with her safe hand out, and we've been conditioned by our society to see that as erotic.
I'm just surprised that was inspired by foot binding, which is so violent, when a hijab makes just like so much more sense here, because it's like equally as non-violent. It's like a non-violent thing that just shows your faith, whereas foot binding is like extremely violent and
yes, and painful. And also, like, on the flip side, you look at something like, now, this is not a teaching of the Mormon faith. However, many women in the Mormon church, and especially those who have left the Mormon church, describe the practice of having to cover their shoulders and wear outfits that specifically cover the shoulders.
Garments. Everyone in the Mormon faith has like garments, I think that they're called. They have to wear underneath their clothes.
Maybe that is true. I'm not super familiar. But I'm describing this specifically because, like, the shoulders are often described as sinful. And it's like, okay, you could have just as easily used your own experience. I think on some level he is.
Safe Hand, and to a degree the reading, is definitely a really great example of what we'll see a lot in Brandon Sanderson, which is world building for the sake of world building. I'm going to invent a cultural norm because it is something that is like different and makes the world feel more fantasy and different and exotic, without really thinking about like why he did that, like why that's in the world, what impact it has, what change it has. Like, for example, Graham, when we were talking just in the chat earlier, we are talking about the fact Roshar has lower gravity, and that's why everyone is, they never measure their height in feet or whatever, but like officially everyone's like really fucking tall. Like, Shallan is described as not particularly tall, but she's 6 feet tall. And then like Yasna's like 6'4", Kaladin's nearly 7 feet tall. Like, and that's all because Roshar has lower gravity. But that's like a little bit of world building where it's like, this is kind of just here to be here.
Yeah, I was gonna say that I liked the idea of the safe hands as a way to control women.
Mm-hmm.
To me, that was like kind of the first idea that I thought Sanderson actually was thinking this through. Yes, women supposedly have all this power, but we're still going to force them to change their bodies, modify themselves in some way, and restrict their movement and the way that they use their hands.
Only women can write, but imagine a left-handed woman. It's like,
no, that's what I asked. Yeah, I was like, well, what happens if you're left-handed? I wish that was more explicit. I wish that Jasna, in her rejection of Vorinism, just used her safe hand normally, like as a left hand. I think that would have been such a cool way to show how the safe hands are controlling, but she doesn't.
That's more evidence to the safe hands being that are an erotic thing. If it was something more like jobs, like more like just a clothing requirement of showing your faith, that would make a lot more sense. But because it's an erotic thing, it's kind of like people who truly believe that like women's chests shouldn't be sexualized, as they are, and like they should be a much more normal thing. They still probably wouldn't go around with their shirts off in every scenario, because like a lot of the erotic implications or requirements or like pressure of decency in society. And that's why I think it says this explicitly. That's why Jasna doesn't reject some of those things, because even though she thinks they're stupid, she still has to exist and like operate in society. And that's harder to do when her left hand's seen as like an erotic thing that would like distract people.
Yeah. Again, something we should definitely have the caveat of is there are plenty of feminist Islamic thinkers who would describe the hijab as a tool of control as well. However, there are also plenty of Islamic women and Muslim women who would not describe the hijab that way. But I do want to have the caveat there of like, there are plenty of people who believe this. And
no, I wish that it was... When I say like I wish the safe hand was explored more, that's what I was hoping, like that's what I would hope for, is that, you know, the safe hand can be both seen by some women as oppressive and by some women as freeing and a beautiful show of femininity and faith, like women in Islam do.
I think the closest we get to that is one of the interlude characters, Rasin, which I love Rasin, by the way. One of my favorite interlude characters. I think like offhandedly she's like wearing a glove and makes an offhand comment about how she's only doing it to like not offend the Vorin people she encounters, but she thinks it's silly.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, that just made me have a thought. I guess this is like, this isn't really spoiler, but like as the books go on, we start encountering more and more people from other parts of the world. Like this first book is very focused on like Alethkar and Alethi people, but as the books go on, we get to see people from all over the world.
I mean, I would say that's true of our powerful characters, but Bridge 4 is pretty culturally diverse.
But actually, on that note of like not really digging into safe hands, I'm trying to remember if with any of the later female characters we get in the story that aren't Vorin, that are not from Vorin countries, if the book ever describes whether or not they're even covering their safe. Not as like it says they aren't or it says they are, just like whether the fact that they're wearing one or not even like is described. And I genuinely can't remember.
I think we should just leave it at that, honestly. I also, like, I guess just kind of getting to the end of talking about women in this book. Okay, so a part of religion in this book is that, and when I read this, I said, oh my god, Sanderson's highest form of fantasy religion really is just Calvinism. Turns out the people in this book have callings. And so everyone chooses a calling, capital C calling, in order to get into heaven. And in heaven, you'll do whatever highest form of your calling is. And the Ardents are there to help you further whatever your calling is. And it's made very explicit that men's highest calling is either being a soldier or being a farmer. Would anyone like to supply what a woman's highest calling is? Go.
Not specified.
Yeah, that's another part where I was like, you really do not give a fuck about women. Like, you really have not thought about anything. Like, you do not give a fuck.
Very careful note. I think they explicitly say that farming is a worthy high calling, second only to being a soldier.
Sure.
Just because that's important. Just because that's important to their culture, that like everything is about war and fighting and blah blah. But
okay, but well, now that's even worse, because now we know number 1 and number 2. And what's even just number 1 for? I'll tell you what it is and what it should be if this made any damn sense. And the highest calling for any woman should be motherhood in a really fucked up way, because they need fucking babies to go to war. literally the first thing that I had not even picked up the book yet, but my boyfriend, Walton, he was like, yeah, so all the men go to war and all the women, they learn to read and they get like super educated. And I said, just based off those two things, I was like, they've got birth rate must have been nothing, because if women are educated, our men are dying at war, no one's having babies. Like, this is a dying country. There is genuinely no way. Educating women, shown to give them goals and give and push back the time when women start having babies to much further, which lowers the birth rate. And then you've got the whole thing where even Laren, I think she was being like over dramatic, or like not over dramatic, but it was like a hyperbole. She was like, Kaladin's mom was like, they take half of the men away to war every year or something like that. And I was like, if they're taking half, which I don't think they were actually taking half the men, but if they're taking half the men away, they're not fucking. The women want to have, like, Adeline is so old for like to not have a wife and children, like in this society that's like at war all the time and like needs like foot soldiers.
He's like 26, I think.
I know. I thought he was like 23 or something, but
well, there's the time difference that like a 23-year-old is actually.
Years on Roshar are different. So
this is something that like I think is funny and interesting in principle, but it actually just gets kind of annoying to talk about and describe, just because it's like, oh, you have to account for this time thing. So like Dalinar is like older, but is actually
we never get Dalinar's actual
well,
age.
Hear me out. What if it actually doesn't matter?
Yeah.
So there's that. It doesn't matter at all.
Absolutely.
And then
that's my point, basically.
Basically, there's no way this country's sustainable. If you looked at their population, like triangle or whatever, it would be just like a funnel that's just like there's no young people. All the young people are dying and not having babies, and there's just... Oh, and then the other thing is that, like, Dalinar has 2 kids. Kaladin's parents only had 2 kids. Like, 2 kids is... If you have 2 children, you are replacing yourself and the person you had the baby with. That is not a growing population. If no one has 3 or more kids, the population is either maintaining or dying. Like, they need to be having so many more kids for this to make any sense.
If you were to guess, like, how this works, or if you were to ask Brandon Sanderson and you're going to come back with an explanation, it would probably be that, like, and this is another thing to talk about, but all of the female characters we have in this book are light eyes, are noblemen, or Kaladin's mom, who is, like, a much higher caste, like, educated woman. For all we know, it could be that, like, with dark eyes, they're not, especially since you made that point earlier about how, like, other dark-eyed women don't necessarily always know how to read. It could just be that our view is biased by we're literally only seeing, like, the only female perspective we get is the aristocracy.
Sure.
But once again, that's not textual. That's just making a guess based on what kind of has to be true for this to make sense.
Sure, but still, even the aristocracy needs to replenish itself, and it seems like it would also be dying if, like, none of these people are having children. It just doesn't... Yeah. You know whose society is fine? What's Rock's society?
Oh, the Horn Eaters.
The Horn Eaters?
I think they're called the Unalaki, like their actual name.
The Horn Eaters, they're completely fine because they're talking about how only the 4th son goes to war or something. So that means, like, they're trying to get 4 sons. So that's going to be, like, at least 8 kids, right? Like, or, like, statistically, or some shit like that. So I'm like, they're doing fine.
Unkalaki.
That society's doing fine.
Unkalaki.
These people are not doing okay. They are dying.
Or we get a touch of this with the Racine interlude, but Shin are also, like, the only people that go to war are, like, the lowest destitute slaves of their society. The highest calling that everyone tries to do in Shin's society is be a farmer or something. So yeah, it makes absolutely no sense with the Alethi, who are, and when we say they're constantly fighting and at war, even when ostensibly at peace, like, they have all these big armies that are out at the Shattered Plain fighting the Parshendi. But even the people that aren't over there are constantly fighting amongst themselves, and that's just a normal part of their society. Like, Kaladin's first soldiering experience before he becomes a slave, he's in an army of a bunch of other young boys fighting, like, a border dispute between 2 high princes, and that's not a failing of Alethi society. That's a feature.
Yeah.
That's like, they are constantly fighting each other so that they train themselves up to then go to, like, the real battle.
It's not 1-to-1 with, like, Valhalla, where, like, if you die gloriously in battle, you get to, like, go to heaven to, like... But, like, it's kind of like that, and, like, I wish he had, like, kind of taken from that culture a little bit more because in that culture, dying in childbirth is the same thing. Like, you get to go to Valhalla if you die in childbirth, which kind of made like I would have loved for that to be like a part of the cult, like a part of the religion in some way, like childbirth in some way being glorious, just as glorious as soldiering.
And like I said earlier, I'm like, I usually have to resist the temptation to be like, oh, well, they'll explain this in this book. I don't have that temptation for this particular failing. I don't think they ever like come back and say, here's why the population hasn't completely depleted.
Obviously, Kaladin's backstory kind of fills in for all of the entire, like, you know, farmlands of this country. There was one bachelorette that we heard of, and like 10 bachelors of like young boys.
We're gonna talk about it more, but yeah, like we barely addressed light eye, dark eye. Real short version is there's a strict caste system where light eyes, people born with very lightly colored eyes, I think it's more than just having like blue eyes like the way I have blue eyes. Like it's like nearly glowing. Like they are like really, really bright eyes. Those people are in charge, like divinely ordained to be like a caste above everyone else. And then there's dark eyes, which is everyone else that has dark eyes. And then even within those two castes, there are other castes called like nons, I think, where it's like,
yeah,
like or dawn.
If you are a light eyes, it's a dawn. If you are a dark eyes, it's a non.
Oh, I missed
somehow
that.
I fully missed that. I was just like, wait, is it dawn or is it dawn?
No, they're two different things. Because Kaladin is of the second most non. It's described as like of him being that highly ranked means there are a couple of light eyes that he's probably on equal standing with.
Or close to. Like he's high enough ranked that he could marry into a low ranked light eye family.
Yeah.
Is I think like the way they describe that. We'll come back and talk about caste system.
Oh Jesus. I was just practicing on how to say Rock's name, Taylor. Numuhuka Maki Aki Ayalunamore.
It's very New Zealand to me.
They're directly, the Horn Eaters, like even to Brandon's words, are like directly inspired by like the Maori and like Polynesian people. Also in general, I know there might be disagreement about the end product, but one other thing people will point to about this book when it comes to interesting world building is the fact that it's not just like Western Europe fantasy. Brandon Sanderson, at least by intent, is trying to pull from a lot of Southeast Asian stuff, and specifically pull from his experiences when he did a mission trip in Korea for several years.
Yeah, and I think he did a bad job of it, at least on some level. I mean, props because textually, every single character that we encounter except for Seth is non-white. Every single character is a person of color.
Yeah.
Now, there's some caveats here. And I guess we're back, but there's some caveats here because remind me what Shallan's eye color is.
Green. And this is like something Brandon has said. Like, if you were to describe Shallan by like Earth human terms, people would probably guess she was like half white, half Japanese.
Okay,
is what he has said. But Brandon Sanderson is also in every interview when people talk about like the racial descriptions of the character, he is very, very firm repeating that like no one here is actually no one here is a one-to-one with any race. There's definitely some you could probably say that person looks a lot like this person from this racial background, but he at least is holding very firm on like, no, because these aren't Earth races. They have similarities, but they're not. At the end of the day, none of these people actually look one-to-one with any racial group.
Mm-hmm.
Except for notably the Shin, which he is described as looking like white people.
Yeah, the Shin are the closest.
A lot of the characters are described as explicitly non-white. However, Alethi society, I mean, granted, Europe has a lot of formal class systems. They don't have a lot of formal caste systems. Now, like, there are still kind of unofficial castes on some level, but never something as strict as Alethi society. However, despite this, there is still a lot of white Western European culture in Alethi society. And because of that, I think on some level, like, that thing informs how the fan base thinks about this.
And to give some context of this conversation, the other day I sent a meme into our chat about how like Sanderson says he bases most of his characters on those of Asian and Polynesian descent, as evidenced by their many descriptions. But then it cuts to 90% of the fan art, and it's just a picture of a bunch of white men named Chet.
Yeah. I think there's also something to be said about the white default. I'm sure you're about to go into.
Oh, absolutely. when someone is unraced, they are assumed to be white.
Yeah.
Like, white is presumed to be the default. White is unraced. White is normal in European society. That's like a white supremacist tactic.
Yeah.
And because of this, there's a lot of that in terms of, like, God, there's so much here we have to talk about, because you can genuinely become a light eyes. And that's a real Mormon thing.
By the way, we also haven't even gotten into talking about the story. We've just been on world building the whole time so far.
Yeah, we'll get into, like, I want to talk about the magic system, but I also think that
okay, just to explain this, as part of the magic system, if you were a dark-eyed person and you pick up a shard blade, you become a light-eyed person. Kaladin explicitly refuses a shard blade in this story because he does not want to become a light eyes. Well, and I think that's principled and interesting.
There's also a little bit of just, like, he looks at the weapon and just thinks about how many of his friends it killed.
Yes.
Like, there's a little bit of that, too.
Yeah, so until 2013, when the Mormon Church apologized for its racist past, whether or not you consider that to be sufficient, a lot of people don't. And until, let me check my notes because I wrote it down, until the 70s, it was routinely taught in the Mormon faith that if you lived a righteous life as a person of color in the Mormon Church, you would be made white in the afterlife. Taylor's jaw just dropped to the floor. Yeah, that's a real thing. When the Book of Mormon makes the joke, in whatever the lyric from the song is, in 1978, God changed his mind about black people. Like, it's a real thing. Now,
wow.
Real quick, I do want to make clear real quick. This change did happen, like before Brandon Sanderson was born and all that stuff. So this is not like an accusation towards like Brandon Sanderson, more just this would be like the culture and mythology he like grew up in.
Yes, and also, well, let's get the exact year. 1978, lifting racial restrictions. Brandon Sanderson age.
Oh, wait, 78? Yeah, I think he's probably alive, but like a kid. That happened.
He's 75, so he's 3 years old. Now,
okay.
It's also worth noting that the Mormon Church doesn't apologize for this until 2013, and the Mormon Church, when someone taught the apology letter in Sunday school, they got fired for doing this, and they were no longer allowed to be a faith leader in the Mormon Church. So, I want to give, like, as much credence to this as I possibly can. But it is one of those things where it's like, publicly, they have stopped doing this. But if someone is getting fired for teaching that they have stopped doing this, you really have to wonder how much this is still prevalent, this sort of teaching. Now, a lot of this... Go ahead, Taylor.
There's also an aspect of it, though, where that the book is very explicit on delving into the theme of the idea of having light eyes being arbitrary as a reason to rule. Like, that is something that is...
Oh, yeah, the book is critical of this.
Like, it's not like they're like... It's not like this is like
Well, here's where it's problematized for me. The book is very critical of, like, eye color as the caste system and, like, people who are born with light eyes are divinely appointed to rule. All of that is very arbitrary. However, it's then complicated by the fact that you can become a light eyes, that you can become white. There's, like, an implicit layer.
Picking up the magic sword that the society is all built around.
Yeah, you pick up the magic sword that the society is all built around, and, like, there's a further layer to it in terms of books that we haven't gotten to yet, so I won't talk about it. There is something where it's like, oh, to engage in the magic system on some level, you become a light eyes, and I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
On some level, it seems like the magic system is like, Sanderson is going, well, yeah, obviously this is stupid. Racism is stupid. I'm putting an even stupider version of racism into my world, so we can talk about that. But then the magic system rewards you with light eyes, and it's like,
you know what it is? Because I think the explanation for that would probably be something like, that's where the origins of light eyes are in charge come from, is like,
yeah,
like that, like that's what. But then again, that's doing the thing where you're looking at racism and you're saying there has to be a rational historical reason why racism exists. It's the exact same thing that happened with Bright, that movie with Will Smith about like the orcs and elves in like modern day, where like the orcs were directly analogous to black people in America, but racism was given a rational explanation. It was like, oh yeah, there's a reason. It's a bad reason, but there's a reason people don't like orcs, because 1,000 years ago they were with the Dark Lord or whatever. It's rationalizing racism.
Yeah.
Even if it's a bad reason, it's saying that there is a reason.
Which again,
I think.
Go ahead, Taylor.
I think what you are trying to come up with is kind of my thesis for this book, and like the notes that I took, which is that this is a book about power, and every single level, and I mean that in every single level: power politically, power magically, and the people that we get to see have power, and that power is complicated in some way. Like, not complicated, but to have power in one realm is to have power in another, socially and magically. And so, since this is a book about power, to be a dark eyes, you need to be a light eyes in order to have power, I think, is trying to kind of, like, I feel like this would be such an interesting book to look at through like a really queer lens, to think about like how the magic system is a metaphor for political power, I guess, is like, and what we're coming up against.
Oh god, yeah, and we'll get so much more of that. Especially at the end, we'll talk about the magic system in detail later, but in this book, we actually get very little of the magic system. From the start of this book to the end of this book, we know so little about how the magic works.
Like, the book doesn't care about dark-eyed women because it's a book about power. And those people do not have power, therefore this book is not about them. Like, this book explicitly pretty much excludes anyone with no power. And so who we get to focus on shows who has power.
I'm trying to think when the first time we get a consistent, regular, important named dark-eyed woman character. To someone that's like, because like right now the only one is Hesina, which is Kaladin's mom, which she's only present in the back in the flashbacks. Which she's a cool. I like her as a character, but she's also the only dark-eyed woman character that has like a voice and a name and all that stuff.
Yeah,
and she is a woman of power though. She's in the second non. And she's educated.
I think book 3.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I don't want to turn this episode into a history of the Mormon Church's beliefs on race, but also I kind of have to, just for a little bit more. The other thing is that there is slavery in the system, and there are two kinds of slaves. There's the slave race, the non-human slaves, which are the Parshmen, but also dark eyes can become slaves for basically any reason, as long as the light eyes designates you so. And it's worth noting that every single one of our characters, except for Kaladin, owns slaves. Be it Parshman slaves, which are noted as the best slaves repeatedly, but there are also human slaves. So at least all of our characters own Parshman slaves, but there are plenty of dark-eyed slaves. Now, they're wartime slaves, which historically is different from like American chattel slavery. Enslaved people during wartime tend to have more power than someone who is suffering under chattel slavery, but like Kaladin is paid despite the fact that he's a slave.
For some reason, he gave this evil country a universal basic income. I don't really get why that happens.
I don't think they say it explicitly in this book. It's not like a super important like detail. How much you get paid for pretty much literally any job you do, unless you're a merchant and like you're selling things and therefore getting the money for that. Your pay is based on your like non or your don or your rank.
Yeah.
So you can have the same job, but if you're a 5th non, you're getting paid less than if you're a 3rd non doing the exact same job. Like, how much you get paid is the fact that you're doing a job and you have a rank.
So specifically with slavery, the other thing that was believed, or was at least taught by Brigham Young, whether or not this is still like essential to the church doctrine, is a matter for debate. But this was taught by Brigham Young. The curse of Ham is...
Sorry, I actually have a bunch of notes on that. Like, I was writing a bunch of notes on that.
Okay, good.
As well.
Well, the curse of Ham is imposed by Noah, the one from the ark, on his grandson Canaan for, like, highly debated reasons. In some version, it's the tale, it's because Ham saw his dad naked. Like, it's as simple as that, genuinely. So, Noah makes the super reasonable curse. All of Ham's descendants shall be slaves. Forever. So, he enslaves his grandson. Because Ham saw him naked. Now, granted, in some versions of the story, it's because, like, he saw him committing an act of incest or something like that. And, again, it's a hotly debated part of theology. Now, the Curse of Ham, despite the fact that we don't actually get a description of what the Curse of Ham looks like, is used as a justification for the enslavement of black people by enslavers everywhere. The Curse of Ham was also closely related to the Mark of Cain in church doctrine, which is the idea that Cain, after murdering his brother Abel, was forever marked in such a way where, like, his sin is visible. Now, in some versions of this is a brand, but many racists have determined that, oh, of course, the Mark of Cain is dark skin.
Can I jump in here?
Sure, of course.
I actually wrote a decent amount about this because it started with me noticing like a lack of a detail. Just to real quick explain the Parshmen. The Parshmen they're not humanoid, but they're not. They are a different species. The Parshmen we get are like the slaves. They're not just all slaves, but they're also dull of mind. Like they are. They're not just described that way. They actually are like they don't seem to think very much. They can't really speak except in like very small ways, and they're just universally slaves. They're not treated as people. They're treated, and I think there actually is a line that explicitly says like, "Oh yeah, Parshmen. Well, they're more like animal than people." Like it's their.
Kaladin says that.
I think Kaladin says that about Shen, and that's what makes the Parshendi, the Parshmen they're fighting, kind of unique and special. It's like, whoa, these are Parshmen that have like a culture and language and like fight and have army. Like it's people.
Seth literally says in the prologue that the Parshendi translates to Parshmen who can think, and then Seth thinks, and nobody thinks that's offensive.
Yeah. Once again, I haven't said this already, but Seth is the best character.
Seth is great. We'll get to more. But so the thing is the way Parshmen look is they have dark skin, like not like normal human brown skin when we say dark, but like black skin, like actually like black skin with like red marbling. And at the end of the book, it's revealed, or at least Yasna believes through her research, that the Parshmen are the Voidbringers, are the ancient enemies of humanity, and that like humanity, like humanity beat them in the desolations and then like enslaved them. And throughout the book, through the epigraphs, where I think I keep using the wrong word. Is it epitaph or epigraph?
Epigraph. An epitaph is what's written on your gravestone.
Yeah. But anyway, it's like in the epigraphs, we get like snippets of like the notes Yasna's taking while she's like trying to discover like what the Voidbringers are. And there's constant descriptions of Voidbringers as darkened, burnt, black, like they're covered in like this really like aggressively, like they are burnt and blackened imagery that was reminding me, Graham, because you've told me that whole thing about like a Ham before.
Yeah.
And like the origin of that. And I was just like, oh God, like, oh Jesus. Like this is the reason I thought about it so deeply is because it's like I kept waiting for the description of a white Parshman because I know they exist. And apparently a white Parshman does not get, and this isn't a spoiler because this is fully just a retcon. It's never addressed or talked about. Some Parshmen are white with red marbling. And it really feels like a thing Brandon didn't think to include until later books. Because it's not a reveal. It's not like a white one shows up and people make note of it and it's like, oh, they can exist. It's fully just some Parshmen start getting described as white with red marbling in like the later books. And I noticed that because I was noticing the darkened blackened imaging. I was like, wow, that's pretty crazy. That's pretty like kind of weird.
It's racist.
Wonder how it's racist. And I wonder how that deals with the fact that some Parshmen are white. And then we kept going through the book and it was like, wait, I guess Sanderson didn't decide that some were white with red marbling in this book yet, in this first book.
Yeah.
So that's another example of kind of like going back and like realizing an oversight and like, and I don't think it's like a good correction, but like technically is like a going back and like But yeah, and then we learn that like, oh yeah, this slave race is who are the ancient enemies and are being punished by humanity by being like they were enslaved because they were like trying to kill humanity. Also includes all of this imagery that's so similar to that myth about Ham and Cain and all that stuff.
Like, I don't want to just say that the Parshmen or even the Dark Eyes are specifically a one-to-one allegory for any of this, because there's other things going on. There's a lot of Judaism and, like, early Judaism working through this book as well. Adonasium, is that what people say?
I think so, maybe.
Adonasium gets name-dropped again in this book. And it's worth noting that comes from Adonai, the Hebrew word for God. Not the only, like, word, but, like, and that's, like, confirmed by Sanderson, that sort of thing. There's also Shen is a Hebrew name, and that's the only named Parshman we get. I mean, technically, there's a chapter title that is a name for a character.
Yeah, I noticed that.
But the character doesn't actually get name-dropped in the chapter. You just sort of have to make the connection.
Which, Taylor, I don't know if you noticed or know what we're talking about.
No, I don't.
There's a chapter that's named after a Parshendi that shows up in that chapter, but it never in the text says like, oh, it's that Parshendi named this. But
yeah.
The chapter title is that character's name.
Is it the Shard Bearer at the end?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. I'd have to go back.
The first time they show up, the chapter title is
their name. The other one to keep in mind is at the end of that book, in that same chapter, when Kaladin shows up and he's glowing from all the stormlight, and he's just sworn the second ideal of the Knights Radiant, as it's described. They greet him as Neshua Kadal, which is not quite Hebrew, but is Hebrew-ish. One, you could read it as Yeshua, which is Christ's Hebrew name, which literally translates means savior. Jesus in Hebrew would literally translate it somewhere around the lines of Yeshua HaNotzri, Jesus of Nazareth. You could also relate it to Neshama Gadal, which is made powerful by spirit or spirit power, depending on how you translate. I am not a Hebrew scholar. I know very little of Hebrew, but you can translate this in several different ways. And it's one of those things where it's like, well, I don't want to say that this is definitely what Sanderson did with Neshama Gadal, but the fact that he's being filled with stormlight and receiving power from a spren, and the translation would be, which is extremely close words, would be made powerful by spirit, is sort of like, well, that seems close enough that I'm willing to sort of just say, yeah.
Which, side note, that's kind of interesting, because I just listened to an interview by him which he explicitly said that whenever he's making up languages, he usually is drawing from his Korean background on how to make them up. And then, like, every example we've seen in this book of like us being able to tie directly to a language he's pulling from is like either Hebrew or Maori.
Yeah.
We don't. Yeah. I mean, I'm not really super familiar with Korean. We also might just be missing it.
True.
Yeah, absolutely. And, like, again, I was raised Catholic. I'm going to be picking up on more of the Christianity and the Judaism than I am going to be picking up on anything else. Unfortunately, Catholicism is in me. Just no way that will always be there. And no disrespect to anyone who still follows it and loves it. It's just not for me anymore. But there's a lot. There's just a lot in there. I can't even bring up that point because it's a spoiler for the next book.
It's like fantasy version.
Wait, actually, Jack, do we know the number of orders yet?
10.
Okay, beautiful. Then I can say this. The 10 orders of the Knights Radiant kind of map onto the 10 tenets of Kabbalah. And it's just one of those things where it's all here. And, like, don't get me wrong. I don't think any of this is bad to include in a book. C.S. Lewis is not writing bad books because he is writing Christian allegory. I think it is important to talk about, though, because I think on some level, Sanderson is... And also... Mormons have a complicated view of Judaism because they also believe that Jews are the chosen people.
Interesting.
Yes.
I did not know that.
Yes. Now, why they do is sort of fascinating. I guess I'll save it because technically, if we get into that, I would really want to talk about something that is technically a spoiler, even though it is a real thing about the world. Or at least a real thing about things that Mormons believe.
The fact that you're connecting it to something in this book makes it a spoiler, though.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, speaking of Catholicism, something that...
Actually, let me just finish my point very briefly about Narnia, which is like, I don't think any of this is bad to bring up in your book, but I think it's worth really keeping in mind and reading with this in mind, especially when so much of the world building is like, oh, look at this cool thing in the world, where it's like, oh, actually that cool bit of world building is either something that is Hebrew or something that is Mormon, especially for so many people who have been affected by like organized religion and hurt by it. It's something to keep in mind while we read. It's like, let's keep in mind how much of this cool fantasy world building is basically Sanderson doing Narnia but for Mormons.
Wasn't I don't remember if we talked about this or not, but when we were first putting together the idea for this podcast, one of the suggested names was Out of the Wardrobe and Onto the Wagon Train, which is a reference to some essay that's basically in detail making the point you're making about this is
Yes. That's
Narnia, but for Mormonism.
I will put that essay in the show notes. This is an essay from Liz Busby, she wrote a article called The Most Mormon Magic System, How Brandon Sanderson Turned Agency into Fantasy. It's a really good essay. It's mostly covering the Stormlight Archive, and it has spoilers up through book 4, which is why I didn't have us read it before the podcast, because I think it's really good. However, it's also worth noting that Liz Busby is a Mormon scholar, and she is a practicing Mormon. And while I think her essays are really good, they are very rarely critical of church doctrine. And she believes that this is unambiguously a good thing that Sanderson is doing, because she makes a case in this article that this is a way to make Mormon teaching really palatable to a public audience, is one of the things that she makes as a case. Yeah.
Oh.
Again, I think her scholarship is really good. I wish she would go into some of the more specifics and also recognize some of the problems with stuff there. But, she's also doing a really excellent scholarship in a way that I don't think anyone else but a Mormon could do. So shout out Liz Busby with a caveat.
This is interesting. I don't want to say this too conclusively until I find the source for it, but I do think it's interesting. I'm pretty sure Brandon Sanderson disagrees that it's a Mormon allegory.
I think he's wrong.
Yeah, I know.
I think I agree. I just want to point out, because I think it's interesting, that C.S. Lewis, there was a level of intentionality to what he was doing with doing Christian allegory in Narnia, while Brandon Sanderson, at least to his own words, and I don't think he's lying about his intention, is not intentionally doing.
I think another thing that Busby brings up in the article, she talks about how Sanderson isn't really doing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where he's telling a specific, he's telling about the resurrection of Christ, and it's like, hey, in our world, Christ was a man, but in Narnia, Christ was a lion, and this is the story of Christ in Narnia. Now, in Sanderson, she makes the case that I don't think he's actually doing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He's doing The Silver Chair, where the silver chair is specifically one where it doesn't map on one-to-one to any particular Christian allegory, and he's creating his own parable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the one that Busby makes the case that is I think the Stormlight Archive is Sanderson's silver chair.
I found the FAQ. He gets asked a lot how much his religion shapes his writing. He says he is not intentionally letting it shape his writing, because he outwardly is very against the idea of using fiction to preach religious beliefs. He's like, I'm not trying to make people believe Mormonism. I'm very respectful of people keeping their beliefs. But he does acknowledge that well, my religion's a big part of who I am, so obviously that's going to filter into my writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think he explores his own religion more than he gives off, which I understand, because that's kind of private. And I also would tell the public, hell no, none of my books are religious, knowing how we've seen all these character arcs, these questions of faith, these ideas about religion that are brought up too often to not be something that he himself grapples with, I think. But obviously, that's not really our place to say. Because
we could talk literally for hours just on this subject.
Yeah.
In the interest of getting to the rest of the book, do we want to move on to maybe the magic system? Because I know, Taylor, you have a lot of thoughts about that.
Yeah, there was just one more thing I wanted to say about Christianity and Catholicism that I thought was interesting. Specifically, we were talking about light-eyed and kind of dark-eyed people. Kaladin is of we hear in Kaladin's backstory that he is of a non or don, whatever, I think non, that is high enough that he could marry into a Laidai's family, but then if he has children who are Laidai's, those Laidai's children would outrank him, which I thought was really interesting. And it kind of reminded me of, Graham, have you read the book Purple Hibiscus?
I know that name.
Purple Hibiscus, I looked up the pronunciation of the author's name.
Yes, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. She's great.
Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I read this book, and in that book, the main character, her father is Catholic, so she grows up Catholic in, I think, Nigeria.
Yeah.
Nigeria?
It's her debut novel. It's set in post-colonial Nigeria. I've read a bunch of her other books, but I have not read Purple Hibiscus.
So in that book, the main character's father, she's a child. I think she's like 12 or 13 or something. Her father is Catholic. She grew up Catholic, but her grandfather is still of the religion of the area. I'm just going to call it pagan because that's kind of what a Catholic person would call it. So her grandfather is still pagan, and her grandfather said something that in the book that I've always thought about ever since I read this book, which was that Christianity is backwards because the father and the son are on equal footing. And because, he grew up thinking that the younger generation should take care of their elders, and he is dying and alone, very poor, while his son is extremely rich and Catholic and does not care about his father at all because he refuses to convert to Catholicism. And so when I saw that the son of a dark-eyed man could be a light-eyes, and that light-eyes son outranks the father, it kind of reminded me of this, in this part of Christianity where being someone's elder doesn't actually matter, and that power doesn't actually, the son and the father are exactly the same. I just thought that was interesting, and probably something that Brandon Sanderson didn't think about, because it's something I didn't think about until I read Purple Hibiscus, which was a really cool book.
That's a great point. I should read Purple Hibiscus. Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie is one of those figures who I feel like, just because of her weight in the cultural conscious, I should read more of her work. She has a TED Talk that I feel like every teacher showed during the pandemic, where she talks about how people respond to narrative more than they respond to fact. So framing things in narrative is really important. It's also worth noting that she's been criticized for her view on queer rights, but, it's a complicated thing. She's a huge advocate for queer rights in Nigeria and vocal in her support from that. She's also been criticized for saying some transphobic things, but really interesting writer, both for nonfiction and fiction. Excellent scholarship from her. But yeah, no, that's a great point, Taylor, of someone who follows a more traditional indigenous belief being outranked by someone who is more willing to assimilate into European culture is all over this book. The other point I wanted to make in terms of the Mormonism of it all is Dalinar is very, very lightly working in sort of like a Joseph Smith analog, because he's receiving a message from God. He's receiving visions from God. Now, granted, this is the Almighty, which is the god of Vorinism, so a specific god. And I think we have already descriptions that the Almighty is not the only god on Roshar.
Vorinism believes he's the only true god, but there are other gods believed in on Roshar.
Yes, and it's worth noting that God himself also describes another god already, because when asked why is there so much war, God responds, odium reigns.
Or sorry, he doesn't respond.
Yes.
Happen to say that.
Vorinism is monotheistic in the same way that Catholicism is monotheistic, because they also believe that the heralds are divine.
Yeah, there are saints.
There are saints. So it's there is polytheism in this as well, because they worship the heralds.
But before we get to that, I just want to make my point of Joseph Smith receives, if you believe what the Mormon Church says, believes that he got a divine message from God, which he recorded down, and that became the tenets of Mormonism. Now, Dalinar receives a message from the Almighty, from God, that says, "Speak the ancient oaths and return men to the shards they once bore. The night's radiance must stand again." And it's worth noting that Joseph Smith is establishing a church through the direct revelation through God, and it's not by reforming a Christian sect, it's about the restoration of knowledge we already had and lost. And that's all about...
That's so big in Storm.
Yes.
That whole idea.
Like the fact that Mormonism is specifically about restoration of lost knowledge, and that is the main thing in Stormlight so far. And like, again, it's important to talk about in these books.
Oh, just also, speaking of like just different religions too, one of my favorite scenes is when Bridge 4 is talking and Sigil, I will say Sigil, I don't know if that's definitely the right
Sigil.
Sigil?
Mm-hmm.
And he's talking about different things, and he's talking about different religions, and he says something along the lines of like, you guys believe in the Almighty, or like worship the heralds, but like there's this country that sees like just the one king herald as like God.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't believe in this almighty stuff. Important note, end of the book, just in terms of like, you know, Joseph Smith, aka Dalinar, receiving visions. The last vision we get is God telling Dalinar, like, I was God, the one you called the Almighty, the creator of mankind, and now I am dead.
Yes.
Odium has killed me. Which, side note, imagine getting visions from God and the thing God apparently this is the first vision he received. He's just having it again. You're getting visions from God, and one of the first things he tells you is like, yeah, Satan killed me. Good luck, y'all.
Well, he didn't know that from the first part.
Yeah, he didn't know that in the first vision. It stopped at a certain point. It cut off
after the storm hit. That was the first time it got cut off, and then it went further in the second one.
And just to explain, because I mentioned that like Dalinar thinks he's responding to him. The entire book, Dalinar thinks the Almighty is like speaking to him and like responding to him, and that leads him to make some like wrong choices, because he asks God like, should I trust Sadius? And God says, like, yes, it's important to unite mankind. And we later learn that, and then that turned out to be wrong, because Sadius betrays Dalinar. But it turns out it's because, like, this isn't God, like, speaking to Dalinar. These are recorded messages. These are not, like...
Yeah.
There's not actually a conversation happening. It's just, witness the vision. He will say some stuff, and Dalinar doesn't realize that till the very end, that it's like, no, these are just recordings that he just thought was a conversation.
The Almighty pissed me the fuck off, because... How are you going to be that unhelpful while also being helpful? Like, you are like, he's so incredibly unhelpful that it's like ridiculous. It's like so like stupid.
He's like, Satan killed me, bring back the Knights Radiant, unite mankind, peace.
No, he didn't say that. He didn't say unite mankind. He said unite them. And you know what Dalinar said? I need to unite all the High Princes. I said, that's not what he said. That's not what he fucking said at all. He said unite them, which is helpful. Thanks, Almighty. Unite them.
Fuck off. Glad you're dead.
If you could just be a little more specific, that would be that would be nice. Fuck, I hate the Almighty, honestly. He's up there with Sadius. Like, he was like so unhelpful. It was like crazy.
Taylor's on-site list. Ellen, Sadius, God.
God. No, actually, like, the Almighty, like, please be more unhelpful. Like, please be more unhelpful. Like, you actually did nothing this entire book, and like...
Yeah, especially, like, once again, no spoilers, like, reading further into the book and not, like, the series, and now I know, like, a lot of, like, you know, the secrets, how things worked. It's like, why couldn't he have told Dalinar all this super important stuff that the characters have to discover later in these visions? Like, why?
Yeah, because of what Graham was talking about in the bonus episode. Everything is a reveal. And
yes, so everything has to be a reveal. So
we are actually defying logic in order for things to be a reveal at this point, because
okay, I did
Almighty's
actually
so unhelpful.
I did want to check. We do get it name dropped once. I was wondering if we got the true name of the Almighty. We do. Honor. Honor is
really?
Yes, because not in one of Dalinar's dreams, but in Kaladin's. Someone shows up and calls him a child of honor. He
also calls him a child of Tanavast.
Yes.
Which, that's my big question. The book ended and I said, okay, who the fuck's Tanavast? Like, actually, if you, that is the one mystery I really do care about. I do not want to be spoiled at all for that, because I really love that, and if I'm spoiled on who Tanavast is, I actually will be sad. Like, I will genuinely, my feelings will be hurt.
We're not going to say any of that.
I won't even respond to you saying
that's like my favorite mystery so far, is like, because we got like one name drop, and then I was like, the rest of the book, I'm like, who is Tanavast? Who is this person? Because I thought that Tanavast was the Almighty, and then we find, I guess if you say it's Honor, but I didn't even put that together. I just thought that the Almighty confirmed at the end of the book that his name is Almighty. And I was like, that's lame. Should be Tanavast. That's why.
He's also Honor, which similar to like in Mistborn, the whole like the ruin and preservation, like the god being like this concept.
Yes.
And Honor's dead.
And odium is also a
Honor is dead.
Odium is also a concept. It's worth noting.
That's also the thing. When I first read this book, I didn't know odium was just like an actual word that meant something.
I mean, it's an archaic word.
What's it mean?
Archaic word for like hatred.
Depending on what you think, there's a religious term for odium, which means like divine wrath or divine hatred. In more common parlance, it's often used to mean hatred that is justified.
Interesting. Is Tanavast a word that I'm an idiot about?
No, that's a fantasy name.
Tanavast is a name.
Okay. Yeah, which is interesting because he also, the one name drop that we got for the other god, he was like, I think it was cultivation.
Yes, exactly.
Like,
that's what I was about to bring up.
So I was like, if the name, which is why Tanavast is so interesting to me, because if our names are, honor, cultivation, whatever, says its name ended up being balance, harmony, whatever.
Harmony.
And, like ruin, preservation, and stuff like that. If that's what the name of the gods are, then like, who's Tanavast? It could still be like a Sazed thing where you like find out that like they have two names and stuff like that. That's what I think's happening.
It's the name Vin is going by now that she's been resurrected.
Oh, I knew it. It's been Vin the whole time.
Again, I can't believe Vin just died at the end of Wind and Truth.
Oh my god, Vin is dead.
It's actually Sazed again. They're doing another Hero of Ages twist. Like, who is the Hero of Ages? It's Sazed. Who is Tanavast? It's Sazed.
It's always Sazed.
It's always been Sazed.
It's Sazed all the way down. But yeah.
But yes, so we have 3 god names in this book so far.
Yeah.
Odium, Cultivation, and Honor, Tanavast, the Almighty.
Yeah.
And then, like, there's also the Stormfather, who we don't really know a lot of detail of, which is Stormfather's one where it's like, is that the Almighty? Is it not the Almighty? That's what it's kind of like. Some people call it the Almighty, some people call it something different. But the Stormfather.
We got like a whole bunch of different names that people could be.
Which I actually like about this book. Like, this book is so, Graham, it's like you were saying, like, discovering old truths. That's actually a thing I really like about the world building. Brandon Sanderson has like the truth of like who all these people are, what their names are, like the stuff that happened, and then did put it through a 4,000 year filter, and now this is what people are saying about all this stuff, which is a mix of truth, false, mixing things together, blah blah blah.
Yeah, I
actually like.
Yeah,
like,
and
I like that part of reading Stormblade, like picking apart like what is the truth of the mythology.
Right, I definitely had the impression in the beginning of the book that they had gotten in the 4,000 years, they had scrambled up who's the Radiance and who's the Honor Blades. But I think that kind of gets figured out because,
The climax of this book is, or the epilogue of this book is a herald coming back and saying he's failed. And we know this to be the herald who was in damnation, meaning...
Mm-hmm.
The herald that was left behind by the others who were like...
In hell.
Maybe one going to damnation is enough and we don't also have to go, so we're just...
And for the record, their plan did work for 4,000 years.
Yeah.
It did.
I mean, shout out this guy for being a real one. Like, holy shit. He survived 4,000 years of torture. And his first thing is to be like, hey, let's get going. We got shit to do.
And then he splats down.
Mountain of a man, too.
I wonder if he's dead or not. I don't know.
God, imagine how big you have to be for the people on Roshar to go, man, that dude is fucking huge.
Also, he shows up with a shard blade, but is described as dark eyed.
Yes.
Well, I mean, it's an honor blade, but yeah.
Yes, because he's a herald, it's an honored blade.
Wait,
the first thing, before we even learn what a shard blade is, the first on the second page is like, the honor blades are more powerful than shard blades. And I was like, oh, okay, that seems important.
Here. Hold on, I am putting the bit of fan art for Tone's return to Kolinar.
He's huge!
Just to see this man.
Oh my god. What a guy. Yeah, I want to talk about I want to talk about the structure of this book, the writing. I want to talk about craft, but I also want to talk about the magic system and my predictions and stuff like that, and things I think are interesting that I just liked. So what do we want to kind of talk about first?
I was really interested. We talked about it a little bit in the bonus episode, but and also there's some Sanderson annotations to tie into this. The prologue with Seth and how it was a great display of the magic system. Because, like I said at the beginning, if you take away Seth, if you take him out of the book, what do we learn about the magic system through our main characters?
Very little.
We learn has something to do with like weird spren, like having a connection to spren gives you these powers. It's tied to oaths, like you have to like swearing oaths gives you more power, and the powers come from sucking in stormlight, which is like we need to put there's so much things to explain to an audience that might not have read this book. Basically, every time a high storm rolls through, gemstones get filled with this magical light called stormlight that people mostly use for illumination. But then we later learn that it's also a source of magic power. It can be sucked in and used for magic if you know how to use it.
It's also their currency,
it's also their currency.
Which is interesting.
But yeah, so what we know about the magic is that like it's powered by stormlight, it lets you heal faster, gives you some funky powers. Like the powers we see it used for are like Kaladin can make arrows pull to something instead, or he can stick things to other things. Those are the only powers we learn from Kaladin, and it's tied to oath and stuff. So, from just the main characters, we know nothing about the magic. It's all still shrouded in mystery. So little gets explained. But then, like, the prologue shows somebody who does know everything about the magic and is using it to its fullest extent and is a horror movie monster slaughtering people with it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like, he starts off just, like, very competent. And then when we get someone like really evil, because the Parshendi are not extremely evil. They have a purpose, or they seem to have a purpose in killing Gavilar, and they want him to do. We don't know what it is yet. Not in this book, but... And Seth also makes a point of trying not to kill the guards around.
Like if he doesn't have to.
If he doesn't have to, he makes a point not to kill the guards around Gavilar. Whereas someone who's like monstrous gets put in charge of Seth. He later turns into a horror movie monster in the interludes, where he's like destroying and killing. Like, I think he kills 3 shard bearers at once, just to show his competence.
It was 2 full shard bearers plus a guy with without the plate, but with just a shard blade. So.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting, Seth doesn't wear shard plate. He's just that good.
And so it's like we see all this. Actually, Taylor, I kind of want you to say it, because you said it great about like we know the destination we're going to, like with Kaladin.
Yeah, like we know where we're going to end up.
You put it great.
Yeah. In the bonus episode, I thought that the function of Seth is very genius. I think because he probably knew that he was not going to let Kaladin get all the way, or let us know like what is even going on with the magic system, that putting Seth there really shows us how complicated it can be. And even Seth's story evolves in the sophistication of how, because in the first one he's just kind of latching onto walls and stuff and running on walls, and then
the way it's described is so cool though too. It's like how he has to keep changing his orientation. It's like the wall is down now, and so the soldiers are the ones standing on the wall to him, and like,
and so since he's like capital L latching himself to different things, then we start to learn that actually further into the book, he was actually even holding back the sophistication he knew then, because he can do half of a latching. He can do like things in certain. He can do he did upwards of a 10th. He did like 9/10 of a lashing, so that he could slowly like descend. He made himself like a 10th lighter, and then he put like a half on this rock that he was standing on, so that it was perfectly floating both upwards and down. Like down was also up and down, so it would just float in the middle. And then he made himself a 10th of the weight, so that he could slowly like elevator his way down into the room below him. And I was like, that is extremely like specific and very sophisticated. The fact that we're going to get there with Kaladin eventually is like insane, considering that all he does is like kind of like barbarian rage himself around and like hope for the best, and like things kind of explode out of him.
Do we
language,
get anything specific on what Kaladin can do after he swears the second oath?
We don't get anything specific on like how his powers change after it, other than it's just like he can use it easier. I think it's implied that like he gets a little more efficient using Stormlight is kind of like
okay.
Like Stormlight sticks to his body better, so he can like it's like because I think there's a thing where it's like Stormlight like it kind of hurts him to use too much Stormlight, and that's less of a problem when he swears the second oath.
And it's worth noting that Seth, who seems to be further along in the magic system, is getting way more power out of about the same amount of Stormlight as Kaladin. Because there's a point where Seth completely drains his Stormlight and almost completely restores it from just 2 lamps, and he's able to take out like 3 dudes in the opening chapter just from these couple lamps.
I didn't think about that.
Reading the annotations, the language Sanderson uses, it's very intentional, exactly what you were saying, where he was like, in the annotations, he describes how he was aware that he was setting up a book with a very steep learning curve. And so he actually was debating whether or not to have that prologue for a while. And he eventually went with it specifically so that he could be like, I want you to see, actually, I want to find the annotation.
It's also worth noting that Sanderson has said in many of his writing classes, don't start in media res, don't start in the middle of things, and also don't give your characters like a really, really long, complicated fantasy name. And it's worth knowing that the opening line to this fucking book is Seth's son Milano wore white on the day he used to kill a king.
And it was iconic!
Yeah, it's great. It's
so
great.
Iconic.
Absolutely. That is a fucking banger opening line.
He probably teaches all of his students that because it's important to know the rules so you can break the hell out of them.
Yes, exactly.
So here's the annotation about the prologue. In Mistborn, by intention, I saved any big action sequences with the magic until the characters and setting had been established. This was intentional. I did the opposite in Way of Kings. There are a couple reasons for this. I spoke on the learning curve of the book. I felt that it was best to just be straightforward with what I was doing. This book would be steep, and you'd see it in the first few scenes. Better to be straightforward with what you are.
Yeah.
And then he also talks a little bit about how he only did this because this was like one of his later published books. He never would have done this if it was his first published book. He was sort of relying on having an audience that knew what to expect from him.
Yeah.
And that's also how he got away with having a prelude, a prologue, a chapter 0, and then chapter 1 and chapter 2 that like the first 5 chapters, which is almost all of part 1, each chapter is a different brand new POV. He like recognized that was like a problem, but he felt so strongly about the necessity of those chapters that he basically said like this will act almost as like a filter. If you can't get through this, you're probably not the audience for this book.
Which is, yeah. I mean, one of my big main notes that I wanted to talk about was how poorly written the first part of this book was. I told Jack this when we were like hanging out one time, but like if I didn't have this podcast, I would have 100% bounced off those first 200 pages because of how poorly written they are. They are, I mean, and it is to the point where I'm just concerned about how this even made it to publication. Yeah, here's how I described it and the kind of the gambit that Sanderson ran when he designed his first part of this book, which is that both Kaladin and Shallan's story begin with failures that the audience does not know the stakes of. So our characters are failing, and I don't care that they failed, because I don't know why this is important.
I don't know her.
Failed. And I feel like a victory would maybe make me care a little bit more because I can understand the consequences of a victory, whereas she keeps failing And she won't tell me why that matters because he wants to keep that as a reveal later on.
The reveal that she's there to steal the soul caster. That is like treated as a reveal.
Yeah, and
Like,
she wants to be there for a soul caster. She's also keeps talking about how they're going to execute her family and stuff like that, but that has no weight because I don't know her and I don't know why it's important that like I get the idea of like being executed as like a very heavy.
I've heard it hurts. I've heard it's not pleasant.
Like a very heavy consequence, but like that's not something that's super on her mind all the time. That was also kind of a reveal. He wrote like this, the first time that these characters get a win is the initiating event, which happens on a criminal page around 160. So you have to get through 160 pages of failure after failure where you don't really care about these characters. Kaladin's also in slavery. He keeps failing at saving people. He keeps failing at... Slavery is also, in this part, written really, really bad, in my opinion. Kaladin, in my opinion, doesn't seem to intellectually realize that he's a slave and that he has no agency. Like, he doesn't really act like a slave does. He has a lot of empathy for his slavers for some reason. Like, it's just all really poorly written. And I don't know, like, I really do not care about these characters at all until we get their initiating events, which is Kaladin being put onto Bridge 4 and Shallan finally becoming Yasna's ward. And so, like, that's her first victory. And so, like, these two characters begin with meaningless failures. And I'm just reading this, like, pulling my hair out. Like, this is dragged on for so long. And it just seemed to me, especially in that first 200 pages, that it seemed like he was trying to justify his page length for no reason by burying so many leads. Like, I need hooks, Sanderson, if I'm going to keep going with your story, because I want to keep going with your story, but you're giving me nothing. You're giving me no leads, no hooks, because you want this to be some sort of reveal, and it just doesn't make sense structurally or as like a audience.
It's relying on you already trusting him that there's going to be something cool.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes part 2 so amazing. And what I really loved about part 2 was that it's contrast of part 1, where I didn't care about the characters at all and they kept failing over and over again. Finally, someone succeeds in part 2. Like,
structurally, I think part 2 is the finest bit of writing we've seen from Sanderson. Like, it isn't like necessarily the best particulars of writing, but structurally, everything in part 2 serves the story, and something in part 1, or something in a Kaladin chapter advances a Dalinar chapter, and something in a Dalinar chapter advances a Kaladin chapter, and they bounce off each other, and it really, really works.
Yeah, real quick, going back to Taylor's thing about the hook at the beginning, I would argue that there is a little bit of a hook at the beginning, in the sense that the first chapter we see Kaladin is not from Kaladin's POV. It's from like a child soldier that was being rescued by Kaladin, and we see Kaladin in his prime. He's a squad leader. He's impressive. He's confident. He's like protecting people. Blah blah blah. Something goes wrong in the battle, and then we cut to Kaladin's perspective, and he's a slave. And so, like, there is a hook in the sense of we saw Kaladin at his top, and now we're seeing him as a slave. What the fuck happened?
Sure, but that doesn't make me care about Kaladin. Like, I don't really care about Kaladin at this point. Like,
it makes me maybe curious.
It hasn't given me something to root for. In some ways, like, in script writing, you talk about the save the cat moment where the character does something like, you know, save a cat from falling in the tree, and then that tells you, like, oh, this is a character I should root for. And like, his save the cat moment is off screen, where he buys Sen, this little boy, to come onto his thing to protect him. So it's like, I didn't even get to see that, really. Like, I would have rather seen it from Kaladin's perspective, because then it seems like he's really saving the cat. Whereas, like, I don't really care about Kaladin right now, and I don't care that he's a slave. I don't really why that's
And
important.
eventually,
Why is
he does give you a good reason to care. It is part 2. Like eventually, it is. It's like
it's too late. I have bounced off the book at that point. It does happen in part 2. I did not care about Kaladin at all. Kaladin gave me no reason to care about him until he started using his surgical, like until he started using his like surgery stuff to save Bridge 4, which was like 200,
Bridge
300
4 is
pages in, and I was like, Kaladin, you were such a hero. I love you so much. What happened? What happened these last 200 pages? Why couldn't you show me that? Why couldn't I see that and love you for all of that time when I just hated reading your perspectives over and over again?
And again, I don't think that, you don't have to, there are many ways that you could have approached this. You could have given us more context for those 200 pages. If you really want to do this thing where you have Kaladin enslaved before he arrives at Bridge 4 and arrives at Sadeas's war camp, give us a little bit more. Let a little bit more out of the pot, because I make this point in the bonus episode, which I'm probably just going to cut and leave it here because it's more important that we have it in the main episode, of so much is left as a reveal that it oftentimes makes Kaladin's point of view, especially early on, boring. And also, not all the reveals are particularly interesting. I don't think that... Don't get me wrong, the chapter where Tien dies is sad. It's really sad. And
it's amazing. I love that. I was looking forward to that the whole book, and I was constantly shocked by, wait, when are we going to get it? I remember this being a scene.
But, it happens in, chapter 68 out of...
Yeah, it happens in the middle of a chapter, too.
Yeah, it happens in, chapter 68 out of a 75-chapter book of 1,000 pages, so it's right near the end. Yeah, it's just the fact that we get it that late, and I'm I don't think it's necessarily bad that we get it that late, but... No, I do. I do think it's bad that we get it that late, because I would much rather have Tien's death earlier on, so Kaladin can reflect on it more in the book, rather than it being still kind of a reveal. Because we already knew Tien was dead. We just, the specifics of it are sad.
It's like what Taylor was saying about getting some kind of hook about, when characters are at their lowest, you need to know the stakes. We get, and the thing is, I'm fully agreeing with you guys. We get Kaladin's personal emotional stakes to us drip fed through all of him doing the stuff, and we don't actually know the full personal stakes of his whole story until the very end.
Yeah, I think structurally, I kind of structurally, I think it does make sense actually that Tien's death is so late, because going into Act 3, the second most horrible thing that's ever happened to him is revealed. And then at our climax, we finally find out the number 1 worst thing that's ever happened to Kaladin. Number 2 worst thing being the shard bearer thing and how he became a slave. Number 1 being Tien's death. I would have restructured it since, this book's all about balance and stuff. Since at the end of our book, we have a Tien chapter, I would have loved to see our Hunger Games, I volunteer as tribute for my little brother chapter. I think that should have been in part 1. Because then I could have really, I want all of the tragic stuff to happen in the end, but I would have really loved a reason to root for Kaladin much earlier. I think that if he had revealed in part 1 that he volunteered because his brother was forced to volunteer, we wouldn't really understand the stakes of that yet without, going into his backstory a little further, but I think that's okay. I think it's okay that he just has his Hunger Games, I volunteer as tribute in the beginning to give us something to show us how honorable he is.
I want to touch on real quick, just because I want to make sure I say this during the podcast. I agree that I think the Tien reveal is where it needs to go, because it is part of my favorite sequence of the book. Things that will always make me cry in any story, in any media, are the Ride of the Rohirrim moments. The moments where people are like, it's hopeless, we're going to die, and we're going to fight anyway. That chapter where we get the Tien reveal, the structure of it is... Bridge 4, Dalinar's been betrayed, he's been left for dead. He's surrounded, he's stuck on a plateau. Sades controlled all the bridges and pulled them away so that Dalinar can't escape. And Kaladin and Bridge 4 are given this opportunity to escape. In the chaos of it, it's they have an opportunity where no one's watching them, they can just use their bridge to run away. And they have this moment where they're looking back and they're being we don't know anything to them, we gotta go. And then God, I definitely highlighted this moment, and I wanna read it particularly because like even on a reread, it like made me cry.
Wait, actually, I have a question. Taylor, did you cry at all in this book?
No.
Okay, so it's just me and Jack.
Wait,
Okay,
you
okay.
cry?
One line really got me. But I'll let Jack find his thing first, and then I'll say my one line.
Here it is. So it's when so they're contemplating, like they've recognized, like, man, this is such a bad betrayal. Like all of those guys are going to die because of Sade's betrayal, and they kind of are
Sadius.
Sadius, sorry. We could help them, but we don't owe it to them, and we're just going to die if we do it. Like this is our opportunity to escape slavery. We don't know anything. And they're thinking about it. Syl has this moment where she mentions that, like, I've realized what kind of spren I am. I'm not a win spren. I'm an honor spren. They don't care anything. Kaladin's going through this whole emotional turmoil about, like, Light Eyes don't deserve anything from him, blah, blah, blah. And then he just, like, realizes, like, no, it's right to save them. And he says to Bridge 4, we have to go back. Storm it. We have to go back. He turned to the members of Bridge 4. One by one, they nodded. Men who had been the dregs of the army just months before, men who had once cared for nothing but their own skin, took deep breath, tossed away thoughts for their own safety, and nodded. They would follow him. Just that, like, casual, everyone just being like, you're right, this is what we got to do. And just, like, turning to go what they believe is basically a suicidal attempt to save Kaladin. And then it's right after that. Well, we get a little bit of Dalinar, like, realizing, like, oh, Bridgemen are coming to save, blah, blah, blah. And then when we cut back, Kaladin's too tired. He's too worn down to, like, fight and help. So Bridge 4 is going to do it without him. And because he's, like, way too worn down. He's too injured. He's too tired. Like, they leave him behind her, like, you rest. We'll take care of this. And he's like, I've been here before. And that's when we get the flashback to him failing to save Tien. And then having that flashback motivates him to stand up. He says the second ideal, burst of power, big anime power friendship moment, and, like, is able to, like, save the day. And it's like literally this sequence is why I love this book. Because yes, the book is really slow. It has structural problems. There's a lot of the book that just is like you're kind of doing nothing, and it isn't until the end that it gets exciting. But, like, I think the reason I love this book is because of this sequence.
And again, Sanderson has a certain gas he can turn on during fight scenes that
I want to talk about that, yeah.
Yeah, that, like, his fight scenes are still his strongest work. The line that got me afterwards is Kaladin has said that, like, for saving Dalinar, he wants his bridgemen to be free. That's his price. Dalinar agrees to this, and afterwards, the betrayal from Sadius, he shows up alive. Dalinar does not have the men to take down Sadius, and also he doesn't want to start a conflict.
He doesn't want to start a civil war.
He doesn't want to start a civil war. Like, you know, he does some political maneuvering. He's not very good at it. But then he says, like, what's the price for your bridgeman? He goes, I'll pay you 2 ruby bromes, which is a fuckload of money per person who's been enslaved. And Sadius just refuses repeatedly, and then Dalinar
wants to execute the bridgemen.
Yeah, he wants to kill all the bridgemen for the betrayal. And then Dalinar summons his shard blade, Oathbringer, slams it into the ground, and goes, "This for all your bridgemen." Sadius is like, "Yeah, I'll take that deal."
You're an idiot. Like, this sword is worth so much more than, like, a couple thousand, like, slaves.
Just
like,
1,000 slaves.
Just 1,000. Yeah.
Kaladin, I might cry while reading this just because it got me so hard. Kaladin shook off his numbness. He scrambled after the High Prince, grabbing his armored arm. Wait, what just happened? Dalinar turned to him. Then the High Prince laid a hand on Kaladin's shoulder, his gauntlet gleaming blue, mismatched with the rest of his slate gray armor. I don't know what has been done to you. I can only guess what your life has been like. But know this, you will not be a bridgeman at my camp, nor will you be slaves. But what is a man's life worth? Dalinar asked softly. The slave masters say one is worth 2 emerald bromes, Kaladin said, frowning. And what do you say? A life is priceless, he said immediately, quoting his father. Dalinar smiled, wrinkle lines extending from the corners of his eyes. See, it's getting to me. Coincidentally, that is the exact value of a shard blade. So today you and your men sacrificed to buy me 2,600 priceless lives, and all I had to repay you with was Jesus Christ, it's getting to me. And all I had to repay you with was a single priceless sword. I call that a bargain. That's so good.
That's good. It's so good.
I interesting. If we're talking about what made our eyes well, the time that made my eyes well up is when it's much, much earlier, actually. Kaladin is looking over at the army, and Syl kind of reveals herself to be like human-sized, and she's looking eastward. And she says, "Are windspren attracted to the wind?" she asks softly, "or do they make it?" And she reveals then that she's an honor spren, but even just like that one line, like, because it doesn't matter, because like Syl is kind of the person who convinced Kaladin to work honorably, but like Syl wouldn't have been there if he wasn't honorable. And so it's like, do the windspren make wind, or are they attracted to it? It doesn't matter, but like, look how beautiful the union of that is. Like, I was like really like blown away by that. I loved that line.
God, because that's a callback. Like, they had that conversation before about like, because Kaladin said something about like, oh, like the spren make this, and she's like retorts with like, do windspren make the wind? And then to call, it's like, yeah, it's like the line like, do windspren make the wind, or are they like just like part of it? I just remember what kind of spren I am.
Yeah.
Like,
so
you're right.
cool.
That line's so good. And then
I was like, oh my god, she's a hero. Everyone's a hero.
And then a little less intense though, but speaking of cooking with gas, like Shallan confronting Yasna
Great.
about the
Where was this Shallan the whole book?
Yeah. You're talking back to the Shallan story. Like Shallan piecing it, like she was caught stealing from one of the most powerful people on the planet, and she got away like good for what she did. Like she like tried to steal.
Can we like break and do a bathroom break? Because I have a lot to say about this, and I would like to.
Okay.
Fair.
All right, I'll go get some water as well. Anyway.
I was almost wanting to request that we hold off on Shallan because I have so much more to say about Dalinar and Kaladin's stories.
Oh, okay.
Like,
We can do that.
Like,
yeah, we just wanted to acknowledge that it continues to cook with gas, at least from Graham and I's perspective, on like the ending.
Yeah, I think I want to talk about like specifically like the like cooking with gas stuff, because I think that this is really when Sanderson gets into his like.
Ayla's licking me from this position. Oh, now she's grabbing my glasses.
Okay, I really wanted to get into this because I think that this is when Sanderson really understands his writing style, and it has matured his writing style to such a cool extent, because Sanderson has written before, or someone mentioned to me before, that the way that Sanderson sees writing is that he is directing the movie that happens in your head. And I think that idea, this is kind of the first book where that idea is really strong, because the book is told in third person limited for most of it. But when we get to fighting scenes, this really cool and really smooth thing happens where we pull out of the character's head and we start to see things the character doesn't necessarily see one-to-one, which I think is so cool and very masterful. I was very impressed by this prose. I think it's something that he hasn't done in previous books quite to the extent that his craft is done here. The first part, or like one of the biggest ones that I noticed, was like things like when, I'm not sure which bridge run it was, but Kaladin was doing something where he was about to go into a battle or something, and he's walking past soldiers, and the zoom out happens when we start to get reactions from other soldiers around that Kaladin is not looking at. He's focused on going into battle, and we have zoomed out to see like the soldiers' reactions, like some of them are scoffing or some of them are like laughing at him or something like that. And so now we have zoomed back and we get to see the movie from out of someone's head. I think another huge part of that is in that chapter that you guys were talking about. One of Kaladin's point of views was, so it starts like with like Adeline's perspective or something, or Dalinar's perspective, and then we cut to Kaladin, but we don't really cut to Kaladin. We cut to a super zoomed out version of Kaladin where we're not seeing any of his thoughts. We're kind of just seeing, it's kind of, the perspective is kind of Bridge 4, where we're just like getting description of what Bridge 4 is doing, like getting ready for battle, putting on their stuff, like getting the bridge up. And we're not in Kaladin's head at all. And I was like, wow, look how zoomed back we are. Like we are not in anyone's head at all. And I think that is like really cool, because that's what, like, to me, that's what like the strengths of like the novel as a medium is that you can like do cool stuff like that, where you can be super, super zoomed in on someone's head, like knowing exactly what their thoughts are. And then in these fight scenes, he is really meticulous and really purposeful, where he zooms out and we get to watch the fight scene, not in anyone else's head.
Yeah. He's doing such good POV work during his fight scenes. The one I wanted to highlight is, I believe it's in, chapter 13, 10 Heartbeats, which, 10 Heartbeats, fucking awesome rule. To summon a shard blade, you have to wait 10 heartbeats. It's not a fixed unit of time, it's however long it takes your heart to beat 10 beats.
So
if you're really in shape. If you're really in shape, it's like, oh, fuck, this person's gonna stab me because I'm in such good shape. But if you're in the middle of a fight, of course, your heart is beating much faster, your shard blade comes quicker. But there's this whole chapter, 10 Heartbeats, is like, no notes. Sanderson did it really well. And I wish this was like all we talked about was this sort of shit of like, God, isn't it awesome when he does this shit? It is a split POV between Dalinar and Adolin, his son. Now, what I think is so good about it is when we get introduced to Dalinar, we come to him, we only get his POV the first time during a fight scene. All of our previous introductions to Dalinar are from Adolin's perspective. We get Adolin's perspective before we get Dalinar's. So we get to see what he seems like to other people. Then, when we go into his POV, we get to see what he's like when he is at his most himself, when he's a fighter. Now, Dalinar doesn't like the fact this fact about him, that he is most comfortable on the battlefield in many ways, and this is what he's most good at. But we get to see him start doing battle with this chasm fiend, which is just like a giant lobster scorpion. It's fucking awesome.
We do get his POV before that scene.
We do, but the first time we get Dalinar as introduced is from Adolin's POV. We get all of that, and then in this specific chapter, we switch into Dalinar's POV, and then he saves his son Renarin's life by being like, bro, you should not be here. You don't got a shard, you don't got a shard plate.
You don't have shard plate. You're just a guy with a little sword going up against a monster.
Yeah, like stand back. And then we fucking do this incredible maneuver where, here's the end of the scene. He had faced Gavilar and laid drunk wine while his brother fought for his life. Dalinar should have been there to defend him. Only two things remained of his beloved brother, two things that Dalinar could protect and hope for some form of redemption: Gavilar's kingdom and Gavilar's son. Elhokar was alone and in danger. Nothing else mattered. Then we switch back to Adolin. We get to see Dalinar run forward against this giant lobster scorpion thing, and the thing is about to crush Elhokar to death with its claw, and Dalinar runs up and fucking grabs the claw. Dalinar, Stormfather, Adolin thought, watching his father stand over the king, bowed beneath the enormous weight of a monster many times its size. Shocked archers hesitated. Sadeas lowered his grand bow. Adolin's breath caught in his chest. Dalinar held back the claw and matched its strength, a figure in dark, silvery metal that almost seemed to glow. The beast trumpeted above, and Dalinar bellowed back, a powerful, defiant yell. In that moment, Adolin knew he was seeing him, the Blackthorn, the very man he'd been wishing to fight alongside. Damn! Cooking with gas there, and it's such good perspective work of just this switch back and forth. And the thing that's fascinating about this is we've seen him do it before, but we've only seen him do it once before, and that's the fight versus the Steel Inquisitor in the very first Mistborn.
True.
And like this
yes.
is this book has the strongest fight scenes that we've seen from him, the strongest perspective work that we've seen since that specific scene. for all of the cool fight scenes that we get with Vin in Hero of Ages, whatever the middle book is called, Well of Ascension, for all the cool fight scenes in that, we never get this sort of work.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that sort of gets to me that I'm now realizing, the reason the Sazed fight scenes, I'm figuring this out right now on the podcast, the reason the Sazed fight scenes where he's just fighting with a little bit of Furukami work for me in the same way, is he's doing that perspective work again. Because think about it, in the Hero of Ages thing where he's just fighting with a little metal grate, we get the perspective of the Khandra that's with him, and also the Khandra he's fighting against, and also when it's Sazed versus Marsh, we get Marsh's POV and Sazed's POV.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, really strong writing, and I can see the master at work. He's cooked.
Lord knows he has cooked.
I think I am ready to talk about Shalon because I am ready to talk about the structure that this book was written with and mapping this to the kind of classic 3-act structure.
Yeah.
Go for it. Oh, I'm actually really, because I forgot that there was like entire parts of this book that Shalon just was not present for. Like,
Yep. She's not in part 2. Or part 4?
Yeah, she's not in part 4. Dalinar and
Basically,
Shalon take turns going back and forth.
Yeah.
Whenever there's a character that needs like a big time jump before like they have story to happen again, they just disappear.
That's not even true though. That was what pissed me off about some of these writings, is that like, because
Shalon's chapter picks up right after, like hours, not even days later. And it might even be minutes. Because
it's honestly minutes, I think.
Yeah, because like the guard has just left. Before we get into that, do we just have any other points we want to hit before we hit Shalon? Because I think that's probably where we're going to be closing.
We have not talked. We haven't talked a lot about the Parshendi, but there's like one note I want to make about the Parshendi.
Really? I thought we kind of talked about the Parshendi.
The one note I want to make about the Parshendi is that the book's a lot about empathy, and the book makes points where sometimes the characters will make a note of like wait, we don't actually know the Parshendi. We don't get a Parshendi perspective this book. We're going to get them in later books, but this book, the Parshendi are just the kind of like faceless bad guy army.
The closest thing we get is we get descriptions of the Parshendi from Kaladin towards the end of the book that make them seem very honorable. We also get Shen, who is a Parshman member of Bridge 4, and he's not really a perspective because he's a Parshman and isn't really allowed to speak, or as the book describes, doesn't really have the cognitive capacity to speak. I don't like how the book describes him that way. And also, I don't think it's true, but I don't know. We'll get there when we get there.
Is there anything else you wanted to say?
Last thing is just, I don't know if we need to talk about it, but one of the biggest cool cooking with gas moments, like the one you described where he comes out with the armor, is explicitly Kaladin made armor out of the corpses of Parshendi in an specific attempt to infuriate the Parshendi. I actually want to talk about that because it's super cool strategy. It is extremely evil though. Like it is like an out of nowhere, like, oh, that's super clever. That's also like really deeply fucked up. Yeah, Kaladin. So like the Parshendi seem to have extremely specific death rituals. They don't want anyone handling their dead who isn't Parshendi. They don't want anyone touching here. Well, yeah, Parshmen would like them to leave in the thing, but the thing is, they don't want the dead moved or touched or whatever. It's like leave them where they died. And like again, it's not specific as to whether it's leave them where they died, because we do get a character. Sigzil says that they have a specific death ritual that they don't trust anyone else to perform and that sort of thing. So Kaladin hears this and goes, "That's cool, bro. I'm gonna strip the skin and wear an arm. I'm gonna wear the flesh of my enemies into battle and also decorate my shield with bones." Parshendi are like kind of crustacean like on their own. They grow carapace and shells when they're in battle. Well, actually, I think they're more bug like than they are crab like, because they have grasshopper legs. Oh, maybe. But not in shape, just in description, like they can jump really far. Yeah. But yeah, so the peel their skin is he's taking the carapace, which of course is like a shell grown over them, and like so it is pretty gruesome to remove. Yeah. Again, there's a lot of dehumanization of the Parshendi, and I think that like this will pay off in later books, but
damn, is it not like, oh, fuck.
I
Jesus.
just, when he was doing that and putting the armor on, as someone who has a very strong sense of smell, I was like, what the fuck does that smell like? Like, that has got to be a rancid. Like,
no, we know what
is
Parshendi blood smells like.
disgusting.
It smells like mold. Yeah.
It's described. Parshendi blood smells like mold.
Nice.
Yeah, and he's doing it for a clever reason, because the whole point is he wants to protect the bridge crews by making the Parshendi, out of rage, turn and fire at him, like instead of firing at the bridgemen.
Yeah,
which also was a little bit of like a sort of infantilizing the Parshendi too, because that makes sense to work the first time, just out of rage, like blah blah blah. But the Parshendi should also be smart enough to realize that they're being intentionally distracted.
Well, yeah.
The actual important target.
That's another thing I wanted to bring up about the Parshendi, is the Alethi have never been to the Shattered Plains before this war, is the implication, because they've just discovered chasm fiends. And in this 6 years of making war here, they developed this interesting system of bridge warfare, and the Parshendi have never evolved in terms of their strategy. That's kind of disappointing to me. Now, granted, we get the note from Dalinar that he goes, oh, these people were never... or we get the note from some character. I don't know if it's Dalinar or Yasna, or maybe it's Kaladin.
Probably Dalinar, because he
makes the note of, like, they're not professional soldiers before
Dalinar,
this.
Yeah.
They did not field large armies. Now, granted, sure, they did not field large armies before, but they're also smart. They would be able to do tactics. So the fact that they respond to every single bridge run exactly the same...
Wait, I thought that it was also a point that they were dumb. Like, I thought that Dalinar was, like, not impressed by their tactics. That's what I got the
I don't think he was dumb.
of.
I thought he was pointing out that, like, Alethi have the advantage because, like, they do nothing but fight. And so they have all of their soldiers are, like, years and years of combat experience, and, like, their generals have tons of experience. While the Parshendi, just as a group, don't have the generations of war, like large-scale warfare experience the Alethi do. It's not that they're dumb, it's just that they don't have literally decades of developing tactics and stuff. But still,
interesting.
It is a little weird that the Parshendi end up being portrayed as dumb, because it's like the reason they fire at the bridges is because they think they'll, like, do something in stopping the bridges. Like, the bridgemen are bait, and the fact that they never pick up on that fact that they're bait.
Yeah, it's why Kaladin's like, oh, they're dumb. It was also, like, a surprise when the Parshendi, like, brought a second army, when the Alethi started bringing a second army, and they were like, oh, they actually do change their tactics. Like, that was, I also got the impression that, like, there is maybe some, honestly, to me, it seemed like there was some merit to say that they were, like, not as smart in warfare. Like,
well, there's not knowing like complex battlefield tactics and formations and stuff, and then there's, like, not recognizing that people are clearly baiting you over and over and over again in the same way.
Yeah, or just the fact that, like, again, we developed, like, several new techniques and tactics during this book, and Parshendi ain't got one dude who's just like, I don't know, boss, maybe we should try something different. It just seems like they would. And again, I don't think the Parshendi are dumb. As far as I'm concerned, they are people. Like, they are smart people, and the perspective of them being dumb is just Alethi POV. Because again, like, we learned that the Alethi are often wrong. We learned that the secret villain of this book is Taravangian, where Taravangian is the one who's been in control of Seth this whole time, and people constantly think he's simple because he had, I believe it's described that, like, he had the umbilical cord wrapped around his neck during childbirth, and the doctors were like, he's probably going to be of diminished capacity because he couldn't breathe. He rides this reputation, like, hiding how actually intelligent he is. So, like, the Alethi are constantly wrong about shit. Yeah, let's switch over, just because there's a couple other things I want to talk about, and those can be separate.
Okay. Yeah, let's talk about Shallan. You guys said that he was cooking with gas in part 4, and okay, here's what I think is going on. Kaladin gets 3 acts, right? He gets to be in all 4 sections, and so the midpoint for his story happens around page 500, and the peaks and valleys map on very easily. Then Sanderson's trying to do something which I think is really cool and very masterful, where the chapters are in conversation with each other. And even though, like you said that like Dalinar and Graham said that Dalinar and Kaladin's chapters were in conversation with each other, but like Shallan and Kaladin's chapters were also in conversation with each other. If something happened in one chapter, it was about to happen in the other. I think a really obvious one would be Shallan's kind of midpoint where Yasna goes out and kills 4 people with the soul casting happens, and then she like steals from Yasna. The immediate chapter after that is when Kaladin finds out in his flashback scene that his father actually did end up stealing the spheres, and so both of them find out that they were betrayed by someone they trust, like back to back. So like they're in conversation with each other in a really cool way that I love, but it's like hard because Dalinar and Shallan don't get to be in all 4 parts, that their arcs are kind of shoved into where Kaladin's arc is because they have to be in conversation with each other in places where it doesn't super make sense for them to be at that point in the story because they don't have as much fleshed out stuff that's going on. Like the high storm happens, Kaladin getting strung up in the high storm happens perfectly around page 500. Like that is the most amazing midpoint. Like things change in a crazy way. We find out all this stuff. We've
established who the Jesus of this book is.
Yeah, he's like coming back from the dead. He meets the dark god. And I said that before we went into this chapter, I said, actually I have it open right here. I was like, Kaladin's he's about to descend into the underworld. He's about to meet the dark god. I'm meaning this hypothetically. He's about to meet the dark god. He's going to be stripped to his barest bones so that he can rebuild in the last half of this book. And then he meets a literal face made out of blackness. And I said, he actually meets the dark god. What the hell? Like, I didn't mean that. Like, I was like, so cool. Oh my God. So.
That's actually Kelsey.
He's like, so I thought that was so cool that he meets the dark. He actually meets a literal dark god, like god made out of darkness, and is metaphorically stripped of his flesh, made to be only bones, so that he can rebuild himself with truth, like rebuild himself to who he needs to be. And I think that's so cool. The scene right after that is the crazy scene where Shallan freaks out about the figures that are following her, and she starts to summon her shard blade, and she passes out, becomes... Oh, is that even true? Am I thinking this differently? No. What the chapter... Sorry, I'm so sorry. Take that back. The midpoint happens... Rewind. That doesn't actually happen. Right after the high storm, we cut to Shallan, and Shallan watches Yasna kill someone, and then steals the soulcaster. So, like... We're in the middle of the book, structurally, Shallan's supposed to be kind of in her midpoint as well, but it doesn't hit as hard because we're missing all the lead up to this, and like, by comparison of Kaladin's midpoint, it's like so not as good. And that's why and I think the same thing happened with Dalinar. Dalinar has to like kind of catch up in the beginning of part 2 because, Kaladin's already had his initiating event, whereas Dalinar needs to, I need to hurry up and like get into my story a little bit faster. There is parts of this that work really, really well, and then there's parts of it where I'm like, I wish you had just let your 3 POVs be in all of the parts, because then we could have really felt their stories in a easier way, especially since you want them to be kind of reflected.
Yes, especially
Kaladin's
because...
story.
I think that Kaladin and Dalinar's chapters like often retread moments, like the fact that Dalinar decides to, I'm definitely not going to abdicate at the beginning of the book. It's not even on his mind because he's so sure of his rightness. Then he decides to abdicate. Then because of plot reasons, he can't abdicate yet. And then at the end of the book, he decides not to abdicate again. Okay, that can be there, and like, it's fine that there's a tension, there's a conflict about whether or not to trust himself. But that seems like, for the ultimate resolution to be, no, I'm not going to do this, it seems like a lot of wasted time where you could have been giving him something more interesting to do, or you could have just cut that down And instead of that taking place over 40 chapters, having it take place over maybe 10, and you could have given some of that time to Shallan, who, again, needs more.
I also, like, at the end of part 2, it's around page 430, I remember, because the end of part 2 is when Dalinar's like, yes, I'm going to advocate, and the last book is like, it's over, or something. And I was like, it's page 430. I hope Sanderson knows that none of his readers genuinely believe that he's actually going to abdicate. No one actually thinks it's over. So the fact that if he chooses, because obviously we were about to be rid of him and go to Shallan for the next, however many, like, hundreds of pages, I was like, I just hope that he doesn't linger on the fact that he's, like, definitely going to abdicate, because structurally it would make no one actually believes you.
It functioned as just a cliffhanger. It's like, we're going to take a break from Dalinar for a while. Let's leave him on a cliffhanger.
Yeah. Also, if Dalinar was king, I think it would genuinely be within his wheelhouse to abdicate. And I think that I don't think Dalinar is the kind of man who wants to be king. And, I don't think he'd be good at it. That would be one thing. But Dalinar is a high prince, and at the end of this book, he becomes high prince of war. So he's just, the best general. And he's not going to abdicate that, because he is. He's just good at this shit.
Yeah, and it's just as a writer and as someone who's interested in structure, I was like, I really hope you don't linger on this whole, I'm definitely going to abdicate thing, which he doesn't. I was happy about, because your audience doesn't actually believe that he was going to abdicate. The same way that, Shallan is going to get poisoned, no one actually thinks that Shallan's going to die. There's no danger.
Imagine that's just how it works. She just dies. And it's just, the whole Carverth arc was just, for fun. Well, just because he wanted to hit 1,000 pages.
Your cat is giving us the craziest stink eye.
She's slow blinking. That's a love. Hand that way, please. She's sitting on the open copy of British War that I was reading before we started recording. I
don't like the way that Shallan... Okay, let's talk about Shallan's stuff, too. Because here's the arc that Shallan was set up with. Shallan is meek. She doesn't stand up for herself. She is very reactive to when people are angry with her because of the abuse that she was subject to by her father when she was a kid. And
she makes the point that her father never hit her, but he was clearly emotionally and verbally abusive, and that her father was physically abusive to her siblings. We get the interlude from her brother, I believe, where he's been so physically and psychologically damaged that he one of the things that he does for stress relief is torture animals. Shallan's family is fucked.
If he had a microwave, there'd be so many.
Yeah. That's another big problem for me, was because, like I said, part 1 is really, really bad. And we do not know why any of these stakes matter to Shallan. It's not really that clear until the very, very end of part 1, which is, again, 160 pages. That's a lot of ask for an audience. Okay, so we find out at the end, we get the impression that she's doing this for her family. She wants to get back to her brothers and make sure that her family is safe. The first of the interludes, not the very first interlude, but in the first of the 3 interludes, we get Shallan's brother's perspective, and we find out that, Shallan's brother is a psychopath, which to me immediately flattens Shallan's story, because I thought we were fighting to get back to our family. Now I don't really even care about her family. Her family is these horrible monsters. At least her one brother is a horrible monster that is a psychopath. And I actually, it's hard for me to feel empathy and want her to succeed now. And so now I'm now I don't even want her to succeed in getting back to her family, which, yeah.
I was just going to say I fully agree. And I think you articulated something that I hadn't articulated to myself before about why I have throughout every single book care so little about Shetland's family. I come to really like her and her story and her goals, but her family more and more is just this whole like this constant footnote of just like
Yeah, so what Sanderson did was like give her one motivation and then completely flatten that motivation for the audience almost immediately.
there's a little bit of a conflict in her feeling guilty about like loving the scholarship and like wishing she could like not be lying and just actually be a ward. But that conflict does fall flat when you the audience are like, well, obviously the scholarship is more important and more interesting.
Yeah. The other thing that I wanted to bring up is specifically on this thing of torturing animals and having like a dark family member is one of the key plot points in Ender's Game, which is also another bit of like Mormon speculative fiction. Like Orson Scott Card is very famously very Mormon. I mean, if you go look at the copy of Elantris that I have on my shelf, on the cover is a quote from Orson Scott Card. Orson Scott Card, bad dude, has written a ton about some extremely homophobic shit, vile man in a lot of ways. However, Ender's Game is just sort of this interesting sort of plot beat. And, like, I wonder how... I would have to reread Ender's Game to think about how in conversation that section is. But I think on some level it is. And not just in a, like, these are both Mormon authors who did this thing. Or just, like, there's something here about, like, the family unit being dangerous that I would really like to unpack, but... I don't know. Maybe in a couple of books.
I think it's too shallow. Yeah, it's too shallow right now.
Yeah, I would have to reread Ender's Game. But I just want to draw that comparison now of just like, it's weird that they both did this in this specific way.
What needed to happen in that interlude is Non-Balot needed a save the cat moment, and instead we made him a villain. And so
he literally gets a kick the dog moment.
He gets a kick. Yeah, he literally kicks the dog. And so we find out that he's a villain, which does not help Shallan's story at all. It does not. It doesn't make her. It makes her seem like an unreliable narrator. It makes her. It discredits her reliability, her credibility, because now we know the truth. We know a better truth about what's actually going on, and so now we're like, Shallan, like, are you gonna address this stuff or like?
I mean, I'd argue that the point, not that this is what came across, but that the point of the being kind of like harms animal thing was actually meant to make us more sympathetic to the family in the dad was so bad, look how fucked up the family became. But like, I don't think that's how that came across. Like, I think it was supposed to be sympathetic. Like, oh wow, they're really fucked up. The dad must have been really bad. Was I think what the intent of that.
I already was lukewarm on Light Eyes at this point. And then he started pulling off crab legs. It was done. It was over. I as an audience, felt like I was led to not really feel any empathy for that guy and want to save him. Like...
You've only met one of the brothers.
Anyways, I bring that up because I do think that structurally putting it there was a disservice to Shallan, and that all he did was pile on the bricks, the heavy burden it was to lift Shallan's story back up. Like, it wouldn't have been that hard to keep lifting, but then you just piled on the fact that the family isn't even that good, and now her motivations are like, well, now I don't even care about her motivations anymore. Like, the one motivation she had, her family, I don't care about. So now what? Now we need a new motivation. Like, why are we even here? Like, what's the hook? So I bring all that up because her arc was supposed to be becoming a girl boss, learning to stand up for herself. We cut away when she's in the hospital after being poisoned and cut back without any work being done. And all of a sudden she's a girl boss. Like, to me, it wasn't earned at all. Like, she just started standing up for herself and not crying when people got angry with her and, like, being cool. And I was like, we never really earned that? Like, she never really...
It's like what Graham said. It's like, where was this Shallan the rest of the book? Like, because it is Cooking with Gaff. It's interesting to read. It's like a cool scene. But it's also like, this is not the same character we've been following.
But it was set up. It was set up that in the beginning she was meek, and it was set up that she was reactive to anger. And so I was like, okay, that's the character arc. she's starting at this point, and we're going to get to, at the end of the book, she's going to, in some way, stand up for herself or get over, or learn to deal with anger that's happening around her in a healthy way. And that scene never happens. She just kind of decides to have a new personality now. And so none of that interesting character work that Graham, you said in the bonus episode last night or yesterday that Shallan has some of the best character work. I do think that's extremely true. I think that the way she reacts to things is really, really interesting, and thinking about how having an angry family member can impact the way that you see anger is like super well done in this book, which is why I was so sad that it completely we got 3/4 of the way there and then he just dropped it because he needed the book to end. Like I wanted our arc to be more meaningful because, oh my god, and I hated the ending for Shallan. Okay, basically the entire book didn't matter in Shallan's perspective because there were no consequences. Shallan could do whatever she wanted. There were no consequences to her actions. She, in the end, Yasna just took her back on as a ward. And the first thing I wrote at the bottom of the page was, lame. That's such a lame thing, because the whole time of part 4 where we were away from Shallan, she had just betrayed Yasna. And then we learned that Elhokar has the same powers that Shallan has, which is like seeing the symbol heads. I was like, oh my god, Yasna's gonna stop trusting anyone. She's going to completely like this is going to have repercussions through the entire book series. Shallan needs Yasna to learn about these powers, and Yasna's not going to and Yasna's going to hate her. And so now she's going to probably need Yasna in some way. And Yasna's being so betrayed so often that she's just so jaded, and she just becomes this jaded scholar who doesn't give a fuck about anyone and has cuts off all ties to anyone because she has that's the last straw. She's been betrayed enough. And I was like, oh my god, that's such a cool scene. Shallan has to go back home and she's gonna be like, what do I do? And Yasna's gonna be this crazy jaded character. She's gonna show up to the Shattered Plains and be like, I don't give a fuck about anyone, I have no feelings and shit like that. Nope, there are actually no consequences. The betrayal actually doesn't mean anything, and it doesn't have any sort of repercussions for the rest of the books that I thought it was going to have. And she just takes her back.
The repercussion is Yasna when she takes her back being like, now this time you gotta promise not to.
Yeah.
So stupid. I was so
or
excited
I'll give you
for
detention.
I thought that this was their antagonist backstory. I thought the rest of this book, it was gonna be Yasna versus Shallan, where Shallan moves up in the ranks and has to ultimately confront Yasna in the 4th or 5th book or something. And I was like, that's so cool. And now I'm like, really?
Yeah.
Really? What was this whole book for? Why
Because
betray her at all? What this is the point of all that?
And for readers, the reason Yasna takes her back, the stated reason, is because Shallan, and this is the scene we are talking about that kind of cooks with gas, was Shallan figures her out, figures out oh, I am piecing together, I'm doing some detective work. Your soulcaster was fake the whole time. That's why you didn't notice I took it, because you just naturally on your own have the power to do soulcasting. Shallan shows she knows this by dropping into that place with all the beads that I can't remember if we learned the name of it.
Shadesmar is
Shadesmar.
Yeah.
Shadesmar is actually in the back of the book. There's a map of Shadesmar.
Oh, nice. Cool. But yeah, so Yasna takes her in because it's oh, yes, you stole from me, but you know my secret and you have the same powers as me. So let's chat about it. I'll take you under my wing.
Let's team up. She was imagine if you didn't have to lie to anyone. You don't have to lie to me about your powers anymore. And I was like,
that didn't feel in character with Yasna to actually care.
Yeah, I mean,
I feel if Yasna comes across to me as someone who does not care that she has to lie to everyone.
Yeah.
Fact,
she seems extremely practical.
Yeah, I was extremely disappointed by Shallan's story because the only hook that I thought was super interesting, the fact that now Yasna is enemy number 1, ended up not being even true by the end of the book. Because I know that the next book takes place where Shallan takes Kaladin's place, where Shallan's arc is she's the main character of the next book. So I was like, oh my god.
She has the flashback. She has the flashback.
She has to go home. Like, she's going to be forced to go home. Like, this is going to be, like, crazy drama.
Yeah.
There's no drama.
The other thing that sort of gets me is for Yasna. Yasna accidentally reveals that she's a Radiant, an Order of the Knights Radiant, in chapter 72. Because she says Yasna held up a hand. These are a type of spren, Shallan. They are related to what you do. 2 Orders of the Knights Radiant possessed inherent soul casting ability. It was based on their powers that the original Fabrials were designed, I believe. I had assumed that but no, obviously that wouldn't make sense. I see now. So Shallan has just revealed of like, this is how I do my thing. But there's no more detail provided.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
we've been introduced to 2 different kinds of Radiant. The kind that Kaladin is, and presumably the kind that Seth is, because they seem to have the same powers. And then also this new kind, or this different kind that Shallan, or that Yasna is.
But still doesn't account for, which is crazy because there's 2 knights. Okay, so 2 of the Knights Radiants showed up in Dalinar's backstory. The Recreants happened. That was only 2 of the orders that showed up to relinquish their shard blades. And now we find out that 2 of them are soul casting, which is crazy because that doesn't account for the other 6. Like, who knows what's going on with the other 6? Jeez.
But also, motherfucker, you don't know all of them either.
I don't know.
You know what they are, but you don't know their stuff.
I know what they are. I don't know their I know in a very broad sense what their powers are, not the like super specific.
To me, it seems like Yasna isn't even the perfect. My prediction is that Yasna isn't even the perfect teacher because I think Yasna is not the same order as Shallan because Shallan's order is the same as the one that Elhokar has. So them 2 are in the same Knights Radiant.
I think also just Shallan is not a particularly good teacher in general.
Or Yasna?
Or you mean Yasna?
Yes, Yasna is not a particularly good teacher in general because I have some friends who are extremely competent and like extremely good at what they do, and they often forget that people can be new at things. So I have a friend who is an excellent teacher when someone is already extremely good at what he does. But if he tries to teach a beginner, he'd hang himself. Like, it makes him so miserable.
Fair. Yeah, so that's kind of Yasna's like...
Yeah, it's funny to me that Yasna looks at this beginner and isn't like, oh god. Well, she is on some level. She's like, oh god, I have to do all this work. Can't you just be good at everything?
This is such a tiny thing that comes with Shallan's story, but in 2010, I don't think that this was a super large genre of fantasy, but recently people have been writing cozy fantasies, which are super, like, you know...
Legends and lattes.
Legends and lattes, where...
Or Bookshops and Dundas, the sequel.
Yeah.
Prequel.
Where the main character is just, like, making a coffee shop. And... Shallan's, what was disappointing to me is that Shallan's had all of the ingredients for a cozy fantasy, and there was just no coziness. Like, I wanted her to be reading by the sounds of the high storm above her. Like, I wanted her to be, like, in plush chairs and, like, doing studying, but like everything is so sterile there. Like everything's rock and everything.
I'm okay
is, like...
that we don't get this because again, I feel like a lot of fans don't like Shallan because on some level just being misogynistic fanboys, at least some of them, but also like for the structural reasons that we've talked about. But like I don't like Shallan because of not because of the misogyny. I don't like Shallan because of like the fact that she's a fucking slave owner and she's a racist white lady. And like that's the part that like if we made this really cozy I would get uncomfortable with because you would either have to take that out, which seems to be a truth about the world, and maybe that's a better book, or you would have to be like, oh look how cozy this is, oh look, the Parshmen are bringing our tea. Like that sort of thing.
True.
That's actually a fun thing because Shallan's not uniquely racist. she's just the character that ends up being the mouthpiece to a bunch of prejudices that exist.
No,
Yeah.
she's the one who says, like, she's the one who calls Taravangian simple, and Yasna immediately is like, no. One, don't be rude to my friend like that. He's, like, a very good man. And two, Yasna clearly understands that Taravangian is smarter than he lets on some level. But, like...
She doesn't know everything.
No, obviously. I mean, if Yasna knew that he was, like, siphoning the blood out of children so that he could learn their dying words and try and figure out what the prophecy is.
Oh, yeah. We never touched on what Taravangian's doing on this book. But...
No, that was a big question mark for me at the end of the book, because why on earth would Taravangian let Yasna leave? Like, she seems like a pretty good target to kill.
He wants to. It's probably my guess is like he relies on this very non-threatening persona, both politically, like between nations, like Carbrinth is non-threatening, and then also him personally, and Yasna's the sister to like the most powerful man in the world.
That he
so
is like trying to
just.
Well, no. Here's the thing that I want to. I think that he knows a little bit about what Shalin is doing. I think he knows Shalin is a Radiant. Because here's something that I don't know if this is ever confirmed, but this is just a called shot. Early in the book, Taravangian's granddaughter is in danger because there's an avalanche. And there's a block of stone that is encasing her in a room. And he specifically goes to Yasna and goes, hey, I'm so sorry. We don't have any shard blades in this city, and like it will take too long for a Fabrial to get to us. Could you come help rescue my granddaughter? And Yasna, being a good person, goes, of course, and goes to help. I think Taravangian did that on purpose.
Oh, that's confirmed in the annotation.
Okay, I think
fully like that was intentional. They manufactured that because Taravangian wanted a closer look at that.
Yeah, I think he specifically wanted to make the point of looking at Yasna and going, oh, she's not using the Fabrial like it's supposed to work. She's a Radiant. And I think that was his goal. For what purpose? I mean, I kind of know, but I also kind of don't. I don't know why he would specifically want to know that. But I think in knowing that Yasna is a Radiant, I think that there's a reason that he's letting her do stuff. But also, I don't know fully.
Yeah.
At this point we know so little of Taravangian's plans. Like all we get from
Taravangian.
For some reason, people when they're and I think it's implied in this book that it's only kind of recently started.
Well, why don't
like
you let me do it since
Oh, okay.
Yeah, what we know about Taravangian's plans are all almost completely laid out in Seth's final point of view in the back of this book, which
great twist villain, by the way, of just
so cool. Yeah. And I thought, probably has other people thought that, Taravangian was going to free Seth or something and be like, I'm your final kill. Once you kill me, no one will have your oath stone or something. And then it turns out he was super evil. And I was like, oh my God, everyone's evil. And so we basically he has the secret hospital in his basement where he gets some of his greatest surgeons to like slowly kill people so that they can utter words in their death, and a lot of them are in the beginnings of chapters as the epigraphs. And then he turns to Seth and he goes, we gotta kill Dalinar, he's trying to unify the High Princes. And I was like, how the fuck do you know that Dalinar is trying to unify the High Princes? What? And so, if he's against the unification of the High Princes, that's why I was wondering why he would let Yasna go, because Yasna's so...
Because killing another member of, like, the main royal family might be another unifying force. Like, another, like...
Yeah, I mean, but I think
way
the
killing of the king kind of brought them
But,
together.
if Yasna is, helping Dalinar so deeply that, like, I was surprised by that. Anyways, but yeah, it does, I guess it makes sense in some ways to, like, let her go, but...
Oh, yeah, like, just getting a little more into the detail, yeah, so, like, Taravangian.
Vangian.
At some point, Vangian. At some point, Seth gets, because Seth, we learn, he's truthless, which we don't know the details of what that means, other than the fact that for some reason, according to his culture, he has to follow the orders of whoever holds his oath stone, which is just like a rock with like a vein of quartz in it. Like no matter what he wants, like no matter what Seth thinks, he has to follow that person's orders. The only orders he can't follow is he can't give up his shard blade and he can't kill himself. He can't like intentionally get himself killed. And Taravangian gets, well, we don't know it's Taravangian. Somebody gets a hold of his oath stone who clearly knows what Seth is capable of. And then sends Seth to go on just like a path of blood, like killing high princes and kings and leaders, and basically throw the world into chaos by just like assassinating all the most powerful people. That's where we get the fantastic interlude of Seth like really kicking ass in a kind of horrific way, because he shows up to a feast and like to kill the king of a country, and then at the end we learn that the person who was ordering this was Taravangian. Yeah,
and our
for unknown reasons, we don't know why Taravangian wanted to do this yet.
Our epigraphs are, well, I think he's trying to learn, because like people when they're about to die have like prophetic or
we know why he's doing the suck blood out of people to get them close to death. We don't know why he's sending Seth around to cause chaos.
Yes.
I kind of also thought that it was like further than that, like since this has been happening for the last like 5 to 6 years, I kind of assumed that he specifically started throwing so much resources into his hospitals in the recent years because he wants the sickest of the sick people to come to Camberanth, so he has a lot of people who are dying here. I don't know if that's ever confirmed, but I think that's...
I don't know if that timing lines up, but maybe.
I mean, he's had a while to put this up, and even if it was like kind of on its beginnings, like he could have really like juiced it up in the last 5 years to really be like, hey guys, like come like if you've got a terminal illness, like get over here, we can cure you.
And it's not just the terminally ill. He's collecting specifically like sex workers and
people that won't be missed.
Is what he describes. He says people who won't be missed, like low people in society. So it's also worth.
That's when they can't find enough people that are terminally ill.
Yes.
It's like we try to do terminally ill people, but there's not always enough of them. So
it's also worth noting that the epigraphs are divided into 3 different things. We have these death rattle quotes that Taravangian is collecting and writing down. We have Yasna's notes, which are things like she'll write down a note from a book and then put its citation, or she'll put one of her own notes on it. Like, for example, one I really liked was, radiant of birthplace, the announcer comes to announce the birthplace of the radiance. Though I'm not overly fond of the Ketek poetic form as a means of conveying information, this one by Alan is quoted in reference to Irathriru. I believe some mistook the home of the Radiants for their birthplace. Also, just like a fun thing in that one of just like a parallel to Mistborn, the announcer is here again. And the letter that we get as well, I just want to point out, that Hoyt is writing to someone.
Yeah, I did catch that.
Okay, good.
Is it just those 3? Just those 3?
Yeah,
those are the 3 epigraphs.
We go back to the death rattles at the end of the book.
Oh, right. Yeah.
I thought that actually going back through my notes yesterday, the first death rattle in the first chapter is the Everstorm's coming in 1,000 days. And I looked it up. I was like, well, how long's 1,000 days? Their asses have like 2 years. Yeah. You need to start working. It's coming.
Oh, fun. By the way, the death rattles are like the biggest source of like community, like theorizing and crafting. Like, what does this mean? Blah, blah, blah. I think before Wind and Truth came out, I think there was only one death rattle that people still didn't know for sure what it was referring to. I think by the first 4 books, people had managed to figure out what every death rattle except for one was referring to.
Which is cool.
Some of them regard moments in history that we later get more information about, and we're like, oh, it's talking about that. Some are about things that are going to happen in the next couple books.
Right,
Some are about things that happened
which I think is really cool.
Like,
the letter from Hoyd, the thing that tipped me off is, I am being chased. Your friends of the 17th Shard, I suspect. I believe they're still lost. I left a false trail for them. They'll be happier that way. I doubt they have any inkling what they should do with me should they actually catch me. And
That's how I knew it was Hoyd, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And we have the moment with Ishik is the name of the interlude early on, where Galadon and Damu and a character I don't think we know yet being introduced here. Galadon and Damu have cameos, which is fun. Oh, okay, so I want to keep talking. I think we all have more to say. I have 8 minutes that I can talk to you guys further.
I have a whole thing I want to say that is like...
Yeah, and I also have... of my notes, there are 3 pages we haven't even touched yet.
So I think now would be then a great time to call it for now, and then...
Yeah, we'll take a break. Actually, let's say the things that we want to hit, and then we can pick back up right where we left off. Yeah, so I guess we're picking back up tomorrow morning. So here's what I have. Bridge 4, Moash Sigzil Rock. Misogyny, Navani, Wheel of Time influence, imagery and themes, predictions, question from Amon. I also want to talk about cutting world building and Ursula Le Guin a little bit. Do we have anything we want to add to that list?
I want to talk about this kind of ties into the Amon question, but like technology advancement in fantasy. One of my favorite, I said this during the bonus episode, one of my favorite parts about Book 4 is Book 4 is so much about like the specific science of the magic, like the fabrials.
Yeah, I mean we get a little bit of like...
You learn so much about fabrials in this book.
We get a little bit of like scientific stuff that's going on because we get the Spren uncertainty principle in an interlude, which is fun.
Yes, and I love that shit. I eat that shit up so much.
A Grain of Sanderson is created by Graham Gilman, Taylor Lane, and Jack McLaughlin. I edit and produce the show. Our logo is by our very talented friend Ven Busby. Our theme music is Goodnight Kiss by Too Mellow off the album Midnight Broadcasts. You can find their work at twomellow.net, that's the number 2, MELLO, and twomellow at bandcamp.com. If you'd like to support the Beachcombers further, you can do that in the following ways. First, please tell your friends about this podcast. Sharing the pod in a Discord, writing a thoughtful post on social media, or otherwise telling your friends really helps us out. You can also support us by following us on social media. Taylor works very hard on our Instagram. Or by buying a book from our bookshop, of which we see a small cut. Both those links are in the episode description. Questions, critiques, encouragement? Please write us an email at agrainofsanderson@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. Let's clap on 47. Beautiful.
Are you feeling good, Graham?
Yes.
How's the energy? Let's go,
Better.
girls. We got this. Big day.
Yes,
it's the Way of
indeed.
Kings. Also, the 5th book's coming out. Or is out. And there's a lot of buzz about it.
I'm so close to being able to read it. I decided, I'm almost, I don't remember if you were here, Taylor, when I said it. I'm almost done with my book 4 reread. I've been skipping a lot of chapters because like I'll get to chapters that are very much just like short setup chapters, and it's like I already know the setup.
Yeah.
It's fine. I know nothing important happens in this chapter.
Or you get to one and it's like, it's an HVAC chapter. I'll skip it.
Wow, HVAC.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Unironic. This is not a spoiler about any contact, but book 4 has a lot more like science and engineering in it, and that's a huge part of book 4, which is why I like book 4. I think more than the broad community consensus is. The broad community consensus is that book 4 is the weakest.
Which I don't even know that you disagree with, but you still really like it.
I do actually think it's the weakest. I just don't like. I don't know. It's the highest highs and the lowest lows, really, for me. Is kind of. We gotta handle the fact that Dalinar beat up his nephew. Told him, "You're putting me in charge. Also, I'm having sex with your mom."
Yeah, like genuinely, he beats the shit out of Elhokar and goes, "Hey, fuck when I don't want to kill you. By the way, I'm fucking
like,
your mom."
Me proving I'm not trying to kill you is to show you that I could kill you whenever I want and no one would give a shit. So trust me. Also, I'm fucking your mom. Bye.
Yeah. Have a good day.
See ya. But yeah, I want to talk about the technological stuff. One thing I was actually surprised about on the reread is like, which I think.
Well, you're about to go into it, aren't you?
Very small thing, very, very small thing, is they reference span reads being a new technology. And that surprised me. I had forgotten about that because span reads seem like they're already so integral to like culture.